Hey friends! Glad you're here at Muse Fanfiction. We've cooked up something special. What if Harry was Merlin's only living heir and the ancient magic he unlocked made the Elder Wand look weak? Liking and subscribing really helps us out. Okay, story time. Chapter 1, The crack in the stone. The Dementor came out of the dark like a bad idea that had been given a body. Harry felt it before he saw it, that specific cold that had nothing to do with temperature, the kind that reached past your skin and found the softest parts of you and squeezed. The Hogwarts Express lurched in the storm, lightning cracked white across the compartment windows, and then the door slid open and the thing stood there, massive and wrong, its ragged robes hanging in the electric air like something that had forgotten how to fall. Everyone in the compartment froze. Neville made a small, bitten-off sound. Ron went the color of old chalk. Hermione's hand found the edge of the seat and gripped it. Harry's scar started burning. Not the usual hot needle prickle he'd learned to ignore. This was something else, something that went in rather than out, like a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for a very long time. He barely registered himself standing up. The Dementor swung toward him. Obviously. It was always him. He heard it, the screaming starting up in the back of his skull, his mother's voice tearing itself apart, and then the cold hit him like a wall and he went down. Except. He didn't pass out. He'd passed out before. He knew what that felt like, the gray at the edges, the cotton wool weight pulling him under. This was different. This was like falling toward the floor and finding that the floor had moved 6 feet downward, and somewhere in that 6 feet of empty air, something in his chest had woken up. He hit his knees. The screaming was still there, his mother's voice, the green light, but underneath it, cutting through it the way a church bell cuts through crowd noise, was something else. A sound like stone grinding open. Like a door he hadn't known existed swinging on hinges that hadn't moved in 1,000 years. Get up, something said. Not a voice, exactly. More like a memory that wasn't his. Harry got up. He shouldn't have been able to. He could see the Dementor looming over him, could see the gray spreading from it like frost across glass, and he thought distantly that the cold wasn't hitting him quite as hard as it should be. Like it was running up against something. Like it was trying to flood a room and finding that the room wasn't empty. He raised his wand. He hadn't consciously decided to. Expecto Patronum. What came out wasn't the thin, shivering silver mist he'd managed in practice. What came out was a stag the size of a house made entirely of white fire, and it didn't just charge the Dementor, it detonated against it, and the Dementor didn't retreat, it fled, blasting backward through the compartment door hard enough to rattle the entire car, and the sound it made wasn't the usual horrible silence. It made a sound like something that had never known fear discovering it very suddenly. The warmth flooded back. The screaming faded. Harry stood in the middle of the compartment with his wand in his hand and the afterimage of white fire burning in his eyes, and the thing grinding open in his chest hadn't closed again. It was sitting there, vast and patient, like something that had been waiting a very long time for him to stop pretending it wasn't there. The lights flickered back on. Lupin was staring at him from the doorway. Not with the careful, clinical assessment Harry had expected from a defense teacher. With something rawer than that. Something that looked almost like recognition. Well, Lupin said, after a silence that went on 3 beats longer than comfortable. That was a Patronus. Yeah, Harry said. His voice came out completely steady, which surprised him. Fully corporeal. First attempt under live Dementor conditions. Is that unusual? Lupin looked at him for another long moment. Chocolate, he said, and produced a large bar from his coat, breaking off a piece and handing it over. Eat that. And yes, Harry. That is extremely unusual. He didn't tell Ron and Hermione about the thing in his chest. Not then. The train ride finished, the sorting happened, the feast happened, and Harry ate and laughed at the right moments and let the familiar rhythm of Hogwarts settle back over him like a coat he'd missed. But the thing was still there. He could feel it the way you feel a room that's been rearranged while you were asleep, everything looked the same but the weight of it was different. The dimensions had shifted. He woke up at 2 in the morning on his first night back, completely alert, with no idea why. His scar wasn't burning. The dormitory was quiet. Ron was snoring in the particular rhythmic way that Harry had learned to sleep through in first year. Everything was normal. Except that his hands were glowing faintly gold. He stared at them in the dark, turning them over. The glow was subtle, you'd have to be looking for it, have to be in a dark enough room. It sat under the skin like light through paper, pulsing very slowly, in time with his heartbeat. He made a fist. The glow didn't stop. He thought, very carefully, stop, and the glow faded. He unclenched his fist and it came back. Right, he said quietly to himself, in the dark of the dormitory. He wasn't scared. He noticed that specifically, that he should probably be scared and wasn't. What he felt instead was something adjacent to recognition. Like seeing a word you've never read before and knowing somehow exactly how it sounds. He picked up his wand from the nightstand. Held it alongside his glowing hand. Thought about the Dementor, about what had come out of him on the train, about the sound of stone moving. The wand felt different. It had always been responsive, the wand chooses the wizard, Ollivander had said, and it had chosen him, and it had served him for 2 years through some truly harrowing situations. But now it felt like a speaker trying to carry a sound it wasn't built for. Not useless. Just, insufficient. He set it down. He held out his empty hand, thought about light, and a small, steady flame appeared above his palm. No incantation. No wand. Just the thought and the fire, gold and warm and perfectly controlled, sitting there in the dark like it had always been his to make. Harry looked at it for a long time. Then he closed his hand and went back to sleep, because whatever this was, it could wait until morning to become a crisis. It became a crisis in transfiguration. Not because he lost control. That was the thing that made it complicated, he had perfect control. The problem was that McGonagall set them the exercise of turning a hedgehog into a pin cushion, which Harry had managed adequately before and expected to manage adequately now, and instead he looked at the hedgehog, thought about what he wanted it to be, and it became not a pin cushion but a small, perfect replica of Hogwarts Castle, accurate down to the individual turrets, turning slowly on the desk like a music box. He blinked at it. The class went very quiet. McGonagall walked over in the particular way she had that meant someone was either in serious trouble or had done something she found unexpectedly impressive and wasn't sure yet which category applied. She stood over his desk and looked at the tiny spinning castle, then at Harry, then at the castle again. "Potter," she said. "I don't know how that happened," he said. Which wasn't entirely true, but was easier than the truth. "That is," she said carefully, "structural transfiguration. Applied. Instinctive. Without a wand movement I could identify." She picked up the tiny castle and turned it in her fingers. "How long have you been practicing this?" "Since last night." He paused. "Sort of." She looked at him with those sharp green eyes that had always reminded him slightly of his mother's and said, "My office." "After class." He went. She sat him down across from the massive desk covered in student essays and an assortment of small animals in various states of being transformed back to objects, and she asked him to describe exactly what had happened on the train. Not what he'd told everyone else, what had actually happened. So he told her. About the thing grinding open. About the Patronus. About waking up with his hands glowing. About the flame without a wand, and the castle that had appeared instead of a pin cushion. She listened without interrupting, which was unusual for McGonagall, who normally annotated conversations the way she annotated essays. When he finished, she was quiet for long enough that Harry started to wonder if she was going to send him to Dumbledore and not tell him why. "Have you ever heard the name Merlin?" she asked finally. "Obviously," he said. "He was the greatest sorcerer of the medieval period. Advisor to King Arthur. There's a card of him in the famous Wizards collection, which is the most fundamentally absurd, that's the public history, McGonagall said. She got up and went to the bookcase behind her desk and pulled out a very old volume bound in something that wasn't quite leather, the title faded past reading on the spine. She set it on the desk between them. This is the actual history. She didn't tell him to read it. She just put it there, and the decision of whether to pick it up was entirely his. He appreciated that, actually. He picked it up. The page it fell open to had a portrait, the moving kind, though this one moved much more slowly than normal portraits, like the person in it was very, very old and had long since stopped being surprised by anything. The man in the portrait had dark hair going grey at the temples, a face that was long and narrow and sharply watchful, and eyes that were so green they were almost gold. Harry felt the thing in his chest move. He looked at the portrait for a long time. Then he looked at his own reflection in the window behind McGonagall's desk. Then he looked back at the portrait. "McGonagall," he said. "Yes." "How long have you known?" She sat back down, folded her hands on the desk, and said, "Dumbledore and I have suspected since you were 11. Since the sorting, if you want specifics. The hat was on your head for 5 minutes and 40 seconds, Harry. It was never that long. Not in living memory. What was it doing?" "I believe," she said, very precisely, "it found something it didn't know how to classify." Harry set the book back down, not roughly but with a kind of deliberate calm that surprised even himself. Outside the window, the grounds of Hogwarts spread out in September gold, the forbidden forest dark at the edges, the lake catching light like a mirror that had been put down and forgotten. He thought about his whole life, the cupboard under the stairs, the strange things that kept happening around him, the parseltongue, the way magic felt different in his hands than he suspected it felt in other people's. He'd always thought that was grief and pressure and bad luck. It was never accidental, he said. None of it. No, she agreed. I don't think it was. The bloodline was sealed. Yes. There's a reason the Potter family history gets murky past a certain point, the sealing hid the lineage from genealogical records. Deliberately. Merlin was very careful about who knew. Why seal it at all? She was quiet for a moment. Because toward the end of his life, Merlin was afraid. Not of enemies, he'd outlived all of them. He was afraid of the people who would use his name to claim things they hadn't earned. He sealed his bloodline and hid it in an unassuming family line and trusted that whoever the magic eventually woke up in would be worthy of it. Harry looked down at his hands. And it woke up last night. I think, she said carefully, it began to wake up when Voldemort's curse struck you as an infant. I think the seal recognized a threshold, death itself, and cracked. And I think the Dementor last night finished the job. She picked up a quill, put it down again. What does it feel like? He thought about this honestly. Like I've been hearing with one ear my whole life, he said, and last night someone fixed the other one. He told Hermione first. Because he always told Hermione first when something needed to be understood rather than survived, and Ron he told second because Ron needed slightly more time to process things that rearranged the fundamental architecture of reality. Hermione went immediately to the library and didn't come back until dinner. When she did, she had 3 books stacked under one arm, a piece of parchment covered in her smallest, densest handwriting, and an expression on her face that Harry had learned to identify as I have found something extraordinary and am extremely conflicted about it. Merlin's bloodline, she said, sliding into the seat across from him and dumping the books on the table without ceremony, is referenced in 12 magical genealogical texts and dismissed as legend in all 12. But the dismissals are interesting, they're not the kind of dismissals you write when something is clearly myth. They're the kind you write when something makes you uncomfortable. Like when Binns tells us goblin rebellions were a minor inconvenience, Ron said. Exactly like that. She opened the top book to a page she'd marked and turned it to face Harry. This text, from 1456, describes a magical phenomenon called the Ambrosius Awakening, Ambrosius being Merlin's family name. It's described as a once-in-a-generation event where a bloodline heir undergoes spontaneous advanced magical development, bypassing standard growth progression entirely. She looked at him. Harry, the text says the last documented awakening was in 1021. So it hasn't happened in 9 centuries, Ron said. Or, Harry said, the records were hidden. Hermione gave him a look that meant he was catching up faster than she'd expected. The seal. Yes. I think when Merlin hid the bloodline, he took the awakening records with it. She turned another page. There's something else. The texts describe the Ambrosius heir's magic as operating on a fundamentally different, they call it a different layer of magical reality. Standard spells still work. But they also have access to something underneath standard spells. Something older. How much older? Harry asked. Then wand magic. About 2,000 years. Ron leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Right, he said. So what you're telling me is that Harry is already rubbish at following rules and now he's got access to magic that predates most of the rules. That's an extremely reductive summary, Hermione said. Is it wrong, though? Harry asked. She opened her mouth. Closed it. No, she admitted. Not really. Lupin called him in for extra sessions that he framed very carefully as help with the Patronus charm, and which were actually something else entirely. Harry could tell by the way Lupin arranged the room each time, no boggart, no practice targets, just 2 chairs and a desk with a series of very old books open at different pages, and Lupin himself with the look of someone who had been sitting on information for years and was now choosing very carefully how much to release at a time. The first session, Lupin had him cast every standard spell in the third-year curriculum non-verbally. Harry did it cleanly, all of them, without hesitation. Lupin made a note. The second session, he had Harry attempt the shield charm, then hit it with a hex, then describe what he'd felt the shield doing. Harry described it. Lupin made a longer note. The third session, Lupin didn't ask him to cast anything. He just slid a piece of parchment across the desk and said, "Tell me what language this is." Harry looked at it. The script was old, older than anything he'd seen in Hogwarts textbooks, runes that had been drawn with absolute precision and then aged into the page. He shouldn't have been able to read it. He was not particularly talented at ancient runes, which was Hermione's elective, not his. But he looked at the parchment and the marks reorganized themselves in his head with the same comfortable logic as English, and he looked up at Lupin and said, "It says the line holds when the stone breaks. The stone breaks when the heir wakes. The heir wakes when death is survived whole." Lupin sat back in his chair. "You couldn't read Old Merlinic script last week." "I couldn't read Old Merlinic script ever," Harry said. "I don't know what it is. It was there. Like the Transfiguration. Like all of it." He turned the parchment back toward Lupin. "Where did you get this?" Lupin was quiet for a moment. "It was in your parents' file," he said. The Order of the Phoenix kept files on all members' families. Magical assessment, heritage notes. Most of it is very dry. He paused. Your father's heritage notes weren't dry. They were sealed. I broke that seal 6 months ago when I found out I was being hired here. Harry looked at him steadily. Did Dumbledore send you? Dumbledore asked me, Lupin said, with careful precision, if I would consider the position. I agreed. My reasons for agreeing were not entirely the same as his reasons for asking. Harry smiled a little. It wasn't a completely friendly smile. He knows what I am. He's known since your first year, Lupin said. He's been managing the timeline of when you find out. Of course he has. Harry wasn't angry. He thought he probably should be angry, and filed that away for later. What does the rest of the file say? Lupin handed it across. The whole file. Not excerpts, the whole thing. Harry read it. It took him most of the session and he didn't speak while he read, and Lupin didn't try to fill the silence, which Harry was grateful for. When he finished, he set it down with the same careful deliberateness he'd been using a lot lately, this new habit of moving intentionally when he felt the vast patient thing in his chest pressing at its edges. The Potter family, he said slowly, has been a hidden lineage since the 12th century. Merlin had 2 children. One line died out by 1400. The other is the Peverell line. Lupin nodded. The Peverells became the Potters. Nod. My father was Merlin's heir and didn't know it. James knew the family was old, Lupin said. He didn't know how old. The sealing was very thorough. It would only unlock for someone who survived death. Which he didn't, Harry said. The words came out flat. Not without grief, the grief was there, a familiar resident. Just without performance. No, Lupin said quietly. He didn't. Harry looked out the window at the dark grounds. It was evening, properly dark, and he could see his own reflection in the glass again. He'd been looking at his reflection differently since McGonagall's office. Looking for the portrait. He didn't find it. He looked like his father, everyone said so, had his father's hair and his father's jaw, but the eyes, his mother's eyes, that particular shade of green that was almost gold in certain light, those he could look at and feel the thing in his chest acknowledge. Lupin, he said. Dumbledore's going to want to have a conversation with me soon. About what's happening. About what I know. Almost certainly. I'd like to have more information before that conversation happens. He turned back from the window. I want to know everything the file says. And then I want to know what the file doesn't say. Lupin studied him for a long moment, this boy who sat in his chair with the kind of stillness that adults twice his age usually hadn't mastered, who had just read the true history of his bloodline without flinching, who was now talking about Albus Dumbledore with the measured calm of someone planning 3 moves ahead. He looked for the lost child he'd expected and found something else entirely. All right, he said simply. I'll get more books. The conversation with Dumbledore happened a week later, which Harry suspected was not coincidental. He was called to the headmaster's office after dinner on a Thursday, and he went without being surprised and without being worried, which he suspected surprised Dumbledore in return. The office was exactly as he remembered from second year, full of spinning silver instruments and portraits of sleeping headmasters and the sword of Gryffindor in its case and Fawkes on his perch, who looked at Harry and made a soft sound and then, somewhat uncharacteristically for a phoenix interacting with a child, bowed his head. Dumbledore noticed. Harry noticed Dumbledore noticing. They sat down. Dumbledore offered him a lemon drop. Harry took one, which seemed to amuse and concern Dumbledore in roughly equal measure. Dumbledore steepled his fingers and looked at Harry over the half-moon spectacles with those blue eyes that were always doing 2 things at once, seeing you and seeing around you, assessing the space you occupied rather than just your face. I expect, Dumbledore said, you have questions. I've actually been getting answers, Harry said pleasantly. I'm mostly here because you asked. A slight pause. You've spoken with Minerva. And Remus. And the books, which were very informative. He picked up a small silver instrument from the desk, one he'd never been invited to touch, one that had always seemed important, and turned it over in his fingers. It was warm. It began spinning faster when he held it. He set it back. You've known about the Merlin inheritance since I was 11. Dumbledore didn't deny it. One of the things Harry had come to understand, in the last week of rapid and comprehensive reassessment of his life, was that Dumbledore never lied directly. He was extraordinarily good at building true statements into shapes that functioned as deceptions. I've known there was a probability, he said. The certainty required the awakening itself. Which happened on the train. Which happened on the train. Dumbledore's voice was gentle. It was always gentle. It was, Harry thought, a kind of artistry, the gentleness. Harry, I want you to understand that my choices have always been made with your welfare as the, Sir, Harry said. Dumbledore paused. I'm not angry with you, Harry said. I want to be clear about that. I'm also not asking for reassurance. I'm 13 years old, I have just discovered that I'm the living heir to the most powerful sorcerer in history. I have spent the last week reading every piece of documented information about what that means, and I would like to talk to you as someone who has been handling this information for 2 years and has some thoughts about how it should be managed. The office was quiet. One of the sleeping portrait headmasters opened an eye, looked at Harry, and shut it again. Dumbledore lowered his hands from their steeple. Something in his expression shifted, not much, but enough. Very well, he said. Tell me your thoughts. You've been planning around the prophecy, Harry said. The one about me and Voldemort. One of us has to kill the other, neither can live while the other survives. You've built a whole strategy around that, around keeping me available as a sacrifice if the moment required it. He watched the old man's face. I'm not going to do that. Very carefully, Harry, I'm not saying I won't fight Voldemort. I'm saying I'm not going to let you script how I do it. Because you built your script around a Harry who was a fairly talented wizard with a good heart and a scar, and that Harry doesn't exist anymore. He leaned forward slightly in the chair. I'm Merlin's heir, and the magic that unlocked in me on that train would have made Merlin himself take a moment. I'm not going to be managed through the worst year of my life and then produce myself at the right moment. I'm going to do this my way. Dumbledore was quiet for a very long time. The silver instruments turned. Fawkes watched from his perch with his bright, ancient eyes. Outside, Hogwarts settled into its nighttime creaks and sighs. You're 13, Dumbledore said finally. Not a reprimand. More like a note to himself. Yes, Harry agreed. And I'm the only Ambrosius heir in 900 years. Both of those things are true. He stood up. I'd like to use the restricted section without a permission slip. I'd like access to the school's historical archives below the basement level. And I'd like Remus Lupin assigned as my personal magical tutor for the rest of the year, officially, rather than this fiction that he's teaching me the Patronus charm. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, the lines of his face rearranged themselves, and something that might have been genuine and surprised delight moved through his expression. You understand, he said quietly, that you are the most remarkable child I have ever encountered. I'm not a child, Harry said, not rudely but absolutely without compromise. Not in any way that matters for this conversation. He moved toward the door. Thank you for the lemon drop. He left. He didn't look back. In the corridor outside the gargoyle, he stopped, leaned against the stone wall, and breathed. His hands were glowing gold again. The thing in his chest was large and steady and entirely awake. He thought about Merlin, the portrait in McGonagall's book, those watchful dark eyes, and he thought about a man who had been afraid of what his name would be used for, who had sealed his magic away and trusted it to find someone worthy, and he thought, I see you. I'm not going to waste it. The glow faded. He pushed off the wall and walked back toward Gryffindor Tower, and every portrait he passed turned to watch him go. 2 weeks later he was in the room of requirement, which he had found not by pacing the corridor 3 times and thinking about what he needed, but by simply walking down the 7th floor corridor and watching the door appear because it apparently recognized him and didn't need the preamble, and he was practicing. Not standard spells. Not wand drills. He was pulling on the thing in his chest and learning its edges the way you learn a room in the dark, by moving through it, finding where the walls were, discovering occasionally that where he'd expected a wall there was instead a window. He could feel the difference between wand magic and the older thing now. Wand magic was like speaking aloud, precise, direct, effective, the air carrying it from intention to outcome. The older magic was like thinking in a language his whole body spoke, it moved through him rather than from him, it reshaped things at a level below the surface of reality rather than acting on the surface itself. Standard spells told the world what to do. This told the world what it was. He practiced until nearly midnight, and when he stopped, the room looked different than when he'd entered. The stone walls had grown warm, lines of light tracing the mortar between them like a buried fire coming up through cracks. He hadn't done that consciously. He stood and looked at the glowing room and thought, how much of this place is responding to the bloodline? How old is Hogwarts, really? He thought about Merlin. He thought about the portraits watching him in the corridor. He thought about Fawkes bowing his head. He thought, Hogwarts was built around this bloodline. Wasn't it? It wasn't a question by the time he thought it. The room pulsed, warm and golden, once, like a heartbeat. Figured, Harry said to the empty room. He picked up his wand and his bag and walked out into the quiet corridor, and behind him the door sealed itself with a sound like a vault locking, the kind of lock that has only one key and always knows who's holding it. He walked back to Gryffindor Tower in the dark, the castle around him enormous and ancient and humming just slightly lower than hearing, and he felt, for the first time in his life, entirely at home. Chapter 2, What the Goblins Know. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in July, 3 weeks into summer. Harry was in the back garden of number 4, Privet Drive, doing absolutely nothing, which was his primary occupation during summers at the Dursleys. Uncle Vernon had stopped assigning him chores after the incident in June where Harry had been weeding the flower beds and the weeds had simply relocated themselves to the compost heap without being touched, in full view of the kitchen window where Aunt Petunia was washing up. She'd dropped a plate. Vernon had gone a color that didn't have a name. Neither of them had spoken to Harry for 11 days, which suited everyone involved. The owl landed on the fence post next to him with more authority than owls usually managed. It wasn't Hedwig. Hedwig was inside, asleep, having delivered a 3-page letter from Hermione that morning about magical genealogical record-keeping in the 15th century, because Hermione had spent her summer doing exactly what Harry had expected she would. This owl was massive and tawny and wore a leather band stamped with a seal Harry didn't recognize. It held out its leg with the bearing of an emissary who expected to be taken seriously. He took the letter. The seal on the envelope was a shield divided into quadrants, a gold coin, a sword, a set of scales, and an open vault door. Below it, in a script that managed to be simultaneously precise and slightly threatening, Gringotts Bank. High Security Correspondence Division. He broke the seal. Mr. H. J. Potter Ambrosius, the above name has been generated by our bloodline verification records as of June 14 of the current year, reflecting an inheritance event of significant legal magnitude. You are hereby formally notified that vaults registered under the Ambrosius estate, sealed by order of the depositor in the year 1007 AD, have detected the survival of a qualifying heir and have begun the process of unsealing. Your presence is required at Gringotts at your earliest convenience. You will be met by Senior Account Manager Ragnarok, who handles all matters of historical magnitude. This is not a request. Gringotts Bank. Harry read it twice. Looked at the bit that said Potter Ambrosius for a while. Looked at the bit that said 1007 AD for slightly longer. Then he went inside, told Aunt Petunia he was going to London, and walked out the front door before she finished the first word of her objection. He took the night bus. He hadn't planned ahead enough to arrange anything else, and also there was something satisfying about arriving at Gringotts via a vehicle that moved through London like it had a grudge against physics. He stepped off onto Diagon Alley in the early afternoon, the summer crowd thick around him, families buying school supplies, witches in robes arguing about broomstick models, an elderly wizard trying to manage 6 cats in a single carrier, and he moved through it with his head down, because he was Harry Potter and anonymity was something he had to manufacture rather than inherit. Gringotts loomed at the end of the alley the way it always had, imposing white marble, the goblin guards flanking the entrance with expressions that suggested they'd seen everything humanity had to offer and found it wanting. Harry walked straight up the steps. The guards tracked him with their flat, dark eyes and then did something unexpected, they stepped back and inclined their heads. Not a bow exactly. More the kind of acknowledgement given to someone whose family your people had done business with for a very long time. Harry stopped. Looked at them. Looked at the door. Went in. The interior was cool and loud and smelled of metal and stone, the cavernous space full of goblins behind counters managing the flow of 100 different transactions with the efficient intensity of people who had been doing this since before England had a king. Harry had been here twice before and both times he'd felt vaguely like someone who had walked into a very serious meeting without an invitation. Today one of the goblins looked up before he'd reached the counter, looked directly at him, and immediately walked from behind the desk toward him, which had definitely not happened before. "Mr. Potter Ambrosius," the goblin said. It had the same quality as the letter, simultaneously precise and slightly threatening. "I am Ragnarok. Follow me, please. Not if you'd like or when you have a moment. Just, follow." Harry followed. They went deeper into Gringotts than Harry had known you could go. Past the main hall, through a corridor he'd never seen before, not the minecart passage that led to the vaults but a different door, stone and ancient-looking, that Ragnarok opened with a key that seemed to be made of something other than metal. Through that door was a passage that went down, and the further down it went the less it felt like a bank and the more it felt like something much older than banking. The walls changed. The carved stone smoothness of Gringotts' upper levels gave way to rougher rock, and then the rough rock was overlaid with runes, not decorative ones, not the kind put on walls for aesthetics, but working runes, active runes, the kind that had been doing something specific for an extremely long time. They pulsed faintly when Harry walked past them. He didn't mention this. Ragnarok noticed anyway. He was watching Harry's reaction to the corridor the way a scientist watches a readout. "You feel them," Ragnarok said. "Yes." "Interesting." He kept walking. The last time a person felt the sealing runes was 1007 AD. The depositor walked this passage. The runes have been dormant since. And now they're not. And now they're not. He stopped at a door set into the rock, a door that looked less like a bank vault and more like a gate, the kind built to last through the end of empires. It had no visible handle, no keyhole, no mechanism. Just stone carved with the same layered runes that had lit up along the corridor as Harry passed. "We cannot open this," Ragnarok said. "We have tried, academically, over the centuries. Our most skilled runemasters. Nothing. It requires blood." Harry looked at the door. The thing in his chest moved with the recognition that he was getting used to now, the deep thrum of something old responding to something older. He pressed his palm flat against the stone. The runes ignited gold. Every single one simultaneously, the whole door blazing with it, warm light pouring into the passage, and for a second Harry felt the 1,000-year weight of what had been sealed here, the patience of it, the sheer deliberate intent behind locking something this thoroughly and trusting time to deliver it to the right hands. The door didn't creak or grind. It simply ceased being a barrier, folding open in sections like a mathematical proof resolving, each piece moving aside with the quiet certainty of something that had been waiting for exactly this and was not surprised it had arrived. Ragnarok exhaled slowly. 1100 years, he said, not really to Harry. To the decade. Beyond the door was a chamber. Harry walked in. He'd expected something like the vault beneath his family home, piles of gold, possibly some heirlooms, the comfortable organized wealth of generations. What he walked into was a library. Books floor to ceiling, shelves cut directly into the rock, the spines arranged by a system he couldn't immediately parse but which he suspected he'd understand if he spent long enough looking. In the center of the chamber, a wide stone table with a surface so smooth it reflected the light coming from the walls themselves, not torches, just the stone glowing from within, warm amber light. On the table, a wand. A staff. A collection of journals bound in something that felt important. And a single object wrapped in cloth that Harry couldn't see through but that made the thing in his chest speak in a register that had no word in any language he knew. He stood in the doorway for a moment and just looked at all of it. "The inventory," Ragnarok said from behind him, "has been itemized over 11 centuries of our most skilled assessors looking at the door and making educated guesses. We were wrong about approximately 40% of what we estimated was in here." "What did you think was in here?" "Gold," Ragnarok said. "Considerable gold, yes. But primarily gold." He looked around the chamber with an expression that Harry was starting to read as goblin appreciation, a kind of flat, controlled acknowledgement of having been significantly surprised. There is gold. But it is not the primary deposit. What is? Knowledge, Ragnarok said. Tools. The working notes of the greatest magical practitioner in recorded history. The legal documentation of every treaty, compact, and ancient magical right that Merlin Ambrosius ever held, contracted, or created. Some of which, he added, are still legally binding. Harry turned to look at him. Define legally binding. Ragnarok met his gaze steadily. The ancient compacts predate the Ministry of Magic by several centuries. The ministry was built partly on the framework of certain Ambrosius agreements, agreements whose rights were sealed with the vault and which now transfer, intact, to the living heir. The silence stretched. What kind of rights? Harry said. Considerable ones, Ragnarok said. Wisengamot membership. Seat on the board of Hogwarts. Right of appeal in any magical legal matter, superseding standard ministry procedure. Right of petition to any crown, British or otherwise, in matters of magical law. He paused. And a classification we don't have a modern equivalent for, which we've been calling Sorcerer Sovereign in the absence of better terminology. Harry sat down on the edge of the stone table because his legs felt like they needed a moment to consult each other. Sorcerer Sovereign, he repeated. The compact, as written, gives the Ambrosius heir the right to speak with final authority on any matter of magical law, magic use, or magical conflict within the borders of what was then Albion and is now Britain, in the event of a magical emergency declared by the heir themselves. Ragnarok sat down in a chair that appeared to have been built for goblins and was therefore low and wide. It is an extraordinary legal power. It is also, I should note, entirely real, entirely uncontested because it was never known to exist, and entirely yours. Harry looked at the wand on the table. It was longer than his, darker, and the wood had a quality that he couldn't name, not quite ebony, not quite anything he recognized. He didn't touch it. Not yet. How long have you known about the vault? Since 1007, Ragnarok said. The depositor came to Gringotts because, in his words, he trusted us to keep secrets considerably better than humans did. He was correct. We have been keeping this one for 1100 years. Something crossed Ragnarok's face, not quite pride. We do not break faith, Mr. Potter Ambrosius. With any depositor. Ever. Merlin trusted Gringotts. Merlin negotiated with Gringotts, Ragnarok corrected, precisely. There is a difference. The trust was earned. He came in, sat where you're sitting, and said, approximately, I need people who understand that magic is older than politics, and I find you are the only ones who do. We agreed. We shook hands. The compact between Ambrosius and Gringotts is also in this vault, and it is also still binding. Harry looked at Ragnarok for a long moment. What does that compact say? That Gringotts serves as the legal guardian of the Ambrosius estate until such time as a living heir presents themselves, at which point Gringotts transitions to the role of primary advisor and ally in all matters of finance, law, and magical governance, at the heir's discretion. He tilted his head slightly. You have walked through the door. The compact activates. We are, officially, at your service. It was not said with the slight condescension that service usually carried. It was said the way you tell someone you're their ally in a war, with weight, with implication, with a kind of fierce straightness. Harry said, I have a feeling the ministry doesn't know any of this exists. The ministry, Ragnarok said, knows what we choose to tell them. We have chosen, for 11 centuries, not to tell them this. Harry smiled. It was the kind of smile that had some teeth in it. Good. He spent 4 hours in the vault that first day. He didn't try to absorb everything, that would take weeks, and he knew it, and he was learning to be patient with his own learning curve in a way he hadn't been before. He moved through the shelves slowly, touching spines, reading titles, building a map of what was there. The journals were Merlin's own, 37 of them, covering everything from early magical experiments to the full account of Arthur's court to notes on the development of spells that Harry recognized as the foundation of things the modern wizarding world treated as basic. Lumos. The Patronus charm. The Unforgivables, not Merlin's invention, those, but his containment of them, his understanding of why they were what they were. The journals were dense and often personal, and Harry read the first few pages of the first one standing at the table and felt time do something strange and telescoping, the 1,000 years between them collapsing into the space of someone's handwriting. The wand he examined without picking up, turning it with the force-adjacent quality of the old magic until it rotated slowly above the table. His wand, still in his pocket, hummed with something that wasn't quite jealousy. The staff he left for now. He could feel, even from across the chamber, that the staff was a different order of magnitude from the wand, and he was not in a rush to discover what that order of magnitude felt like without more preparation. The wrapped object on the table he circled twice and didn't unwrap. Ragnarok watched him and didn't press. "What is that?" Harry asked finally, pointing at it. "We don't know," Ragnarok said. "Our assessors could not penetrate the wrapping. It is sealed in the same magic as the vault door. It will open when it opens." Harry looked at it. The thing in his chest said something about it in that wordless language he was still learning to translate. Something like, "Not yet, but soon." "All right," he said. "I'll come back." "You'll need somewhere to work through the materials," Ragnarok said. He stood, moving with the efficient compactness of goblins, and gestured to a door at the back of the chamber Harry hadn't noticed. "There is an adjoining chamber. It has been furnished periodically over the centuries in anticipation of an heir's arrival. We may have overprepared." Harry opened the door. The adjoining chamber had been furnished by people who'd had 11 centuries and considerable resources and absolutely nothing but time to think about what a powerful wizard might need. There was a bed, solid stone base with actual comfortable-looking mattress and blankets. A desk. More bookshelves. A fireplace that lit when Harry walked in, responding to him the way the room of requirement did, the way everything magical seemed to respond to him now, with a kind of immediate recognition. There were clothes in a wardrobe that fit him, which was unsettling until he realized they'd probably been tailored by magic and adjusted automatically. There was also, sitting on the desk, a mirror of polished bronze that he did not recognize but that reflected him with unusual clarity, showing not just his face but the faint golden undertone of the bloodline sitting behind his eyes. "You can stay here," Ragnarok said from the doorway. "If you choose. You are a Gringotts account holder of historical significance. The bank's protection extends to you personally as well as your assets, while you are on the premises." Harry thought about Privet Drive. About the back garden and the weeding and 11 days of silence. He thought about Hermione and Ron, both of whom would need to know about this. "Can I bring people with me?" he asked. "Into the vault? My friends?" Ragnarok considered this with the thoroughness goblins brought to all decisions. The vault responded to bloodline. Guests could be admitted at your authorization, though they cannot access the sealed materials without your presence. He paused. "It is irregular. I imagine most of this is irregular." "Extremely," Ragnarok agreed. "We have never managed an Ambrosius estate before. We are improvising somewhat." Harry grinned. He hadn't planned to, it just arrived, wide and genuine, the way the best grins did. "First time for everything," he said. "I'm going to go get my friends." He fire-called Ron from the leaky cauldron. Ron appeared in the flames looking like someone had got him out of bed despite it being 2 in the afternoon, his hair at an angle that defied structural explanation, a half-eaten sandwich in one hand. He stared at Harry with the focused confusion that meant he was paying maximum attention. "You're at the leaky," Ron said. "And you need to be here in an hour," Harry said. "You and Hermione. What happened?" "I found Merlin's vault." A pause. The sandwich stopped moving halfway to Ron's mouth. "You found Merlin's vault. There's a lot in it." Including some legal documents that I think are going to cause a significant number of people a significant amount of distress. Hermione is going to lose her mind, Ron said, with the tone of someone who had considered this fully and accepted it as collateral damage. She is, Harry agreed. In the best possible way. Can you come? Obviously, Ron said. Yes. An hour. He disappeared from the flames and Harry heard him distantly shouting, "Mum, I need to fly to London. No, I don't have time to finish the sandwich before the fire went green and settled." Hermione arrived 40 minutes later, which meant she'd been in the leaky cauldron in 30, in Diagon Alley in 20, and had probably spent the remaining 10 minutes outside Gringotts reading the inscription above the entrance and making notes. She appeared at Harry's elbow with her hair slightly windswept and a leather satchel she'd clearly grabbed as a reflex because a situation involving ancient documents was not a situation you entered without something to write on. She looked at him. "Harry, what did you—" "I'll explain inside," he said. "Or actually the explanation will mostly explain itself once you see it." They waited for Ron, who arrived flushed and still chewing, and then Harry walked them both up the steps of Gringotts, past the guards who inclined their heads again, and through the main hall to where Ragnarok was waiting. Ron and Hermione both clocked Ragnarok's posture immediately, the way a senior official stands when they're meeting someone they respect rather than someone they're processing. "Your friends," Ragnarok said, looking at them with a flat assessment that was probably complimentary in goblin terms. "Come." In the passage, with the runes lighting as Harry walked, Hermione made a sound beside him that was somewhere between a gasp and a whispered "oh my," and then she was silent and he could tell she was reading them as they passed. She could read old runes. He'd forgotten. He could feel her pulling her hand back from reaching out to touch them. "You can touch them," he told her. "I shouldn't, Hermione, they're 1,000 years old and you're about to spend the next month reading them anyway." "Touch them." She touched one. It flared gold under her fingers, then settled to a soft pulse. She looked at Harry with an expression he didn't have a word for. Ron had been looking at the walls with the specific expression he used when something was happening that was large enough that his brain was taking a running start. "Harry," he said. "Yeah. You said vault. I thought you meant like, a vault." "It is a vault. It's a passage with working millennium-old runes responding to you just walking by it. It's not a vault, it's a place." "Wait until you see the door," Harry said. The door was, if anything, more impressive the second time. He put his hand to it again and it opened with the same gold cascade, and Hermione made the sound again, louder, and Ron said something under his breath that definitely couldn't be repeated in polite company and possibly not in impolite company either. They walked in. The chamber received them. The walls glowed warmer, and Harry noticed that the bookshelves, which had been still and orderly when he'd left, had rearranged themselves slightly, certain volumes pulled fractionally forward on their shelves, as if the room had assessed his friends and made suggestions. Hermione stood in the middle of the chamber and turned in a full slow circle, head tilted back to see the height of the shelves, and said, "This is Merlin's personal library." "Yes," Harry said. "His actual personal library. Not copies. Not references to his work. The original materials." "Yes." She looked at him. "And it's yours." "Apparently." She opened her mouth, closed it, turned back to the shelves, and said, in a very small voice, "I need to sit down." Ron sat with her. He put his arm around her shoulders and she didn't shrug it off, which meant she was genuinely overwhelmed, because under normal circumstances Hermione's response to people trying to comfort her in libraries was a pointed look and a bookmark. Harry gave them a minute. He went to the table, looked at the wand and the wrapped object and the journals, and then looked at Ragnarok, who had positioned himself near the door with the discretion of someone practiced at giving people space to process remarkable information. "The legal documents," Harry said to him. "The Wisengamot seat and the rest, how do we activate those?" "A formal claim, submitted through us, to the Ministry of Magic's Office of Lineage and Inheritance," Ragnarok said. "Typically a straightforward matter of paperwork. In this case," he added, "somewhat less than straightforward, given the age and scope of the claim. What kind of response should I expect from the ministry? Alarm, Ragnarok said, without hesitation. Followed by denial. Followed, when the documentation proves incontestable, by a series of procedural delays and very expensive arguments. A pause. They will also almost certainly go to Dumbledore before they go anywhere else. Let them, Harry said. He picked up the first of Merlin's journals, turned it over in his hands. We'll file the claim formally. Right now, today, so it's dated and time-stamped before anyone can move to stop it. Draft the paperwork, whatever you need from me. We'll do it before I leave today. There will be consequences, Ragnarok said. I know. The ministry will not quietly accept the emergence of an Ambrosius heir with legally binding historical powers. There are people in positions of authority whose power base depends on the current structure. I know that too. Harry set the journal back on the table. Ragnarok. Merlin built the original framework. The ministry built their power inside that framework and then sealed the foundation because it gave them more control. I'm pulling the foundation back out. Some things are going to fall. I'm aware. Ragnarok studied him with those flat, dark eyes that Harry was learning to read, the subtle indicators of goblin approval, which were nothing like human approval and all the more meaningful for it. You are, Ragnarok said slowly, very like the description we were given of the depositor. How so? He said something similar, the day he sealed the vault. That he had built the foundations of something and that the men who came after him would try to use it as a ceiling. He said he hoped his heir would understand that ceilings could be moved. Harry thought about that. Did he say anything else? Ragnarok was quiet for a moment. Then, he said to tell his heir, whenever they arrived, that surviving death was not the remarkable part. The remarkable part was what you chose to do with the life on the other side of it. The chamber was very still. From across the room, Ron said quietly, Harry. Harry looked over. Ron was looking at the wrapped object on the table, and his expression was unusual, not the awe-adjacent thing he'd been wearing since they'd walked in. Something more specific. That thing's been looking at you, Ron said. Objects don't, Hermione started. I know what objects do, Hermione, and I'm telling you that thing has been oriented toward Harry since we walked in. The cloth is moving. Slightly. Like it was breathing. Harry looked at the wrapped object. The thing in his chest said the same thing it had said last time, in the same wordless language. Not yet, but soon. Except this time the soon had a different quality. This time it felt like an arrival rather than a warning. He walked over. He didn't think about it. He put both hands on the cloth and pulled it away. What lay beneath it was a stone. Flat and palm-sized and unremarkable in every physical quality, grayish, smooth, the kind of thing you'd pick up on a beach and then put down again. On its surface, the same runes as the vault door. But alive in a way the vault door's runes had been static. He picked it up. The world went white. Not blindingly, not like a flash. More like when you're in a room with low light and someone gradually raises the brightness, and at first you don't notice and then you realize everything looks different. The stone in his hand was warm and the warmth moved up his arm and connected to the thing in his chest and the thing in his chest opened, fully, for the first time, like a room where every window had just been unshuttered simultaneously. He heard Hermione say his name from a distance. He heard Ron say something sharper. He was fine, he could feel that he was fine, standing on the floor, both feet, entirely himself. But the stone was talking to him in the wordless language, and now he could understand it, every word. The awakening stone, it said. Last made by my hand. First held by yours. You are late. I don't say that as criticism. Time is what it is. There is a great deal to tell you and not enough time in a single life to tell it. So we will do what we can. Begin at the beginning, which is not your beginning. It is mine. The warmth intensified and Harry saw things, not visions exactly. More like memories that weren't his that he was borrowing, being given deliberately, sorted and prioritized by something very old and very specific about what this particular heir would need to know right now. He saw a court that might have been Arthur's. He saw a war that predated it. He saw the creation of magical law from its first principle, the original agreements between magical Britain and the land itself, between wizards and creatures, between power and responsibility. He saw the moments Voldemort had stolen from those agreements, the ways the dark arts had corrupted them, and he saw, clearly, like a map with a route already marked, what it would take to undo it. It took approximately 4 seconds of real time. He came back to the chamber with his hand around the stone and the warmth settling into him like a new layer of himself that had always been theoretical and was now structural. "Harry," Hermione said. She was right next to him. She'd moved fast, which meant she'd been worried. "What was that?" "The stone," he said. "Merlin left it. It's..." He tried to find the words. "It's an instruction manual. For being this." He held it up. In the amber light of the chamber it looked exactly as unremarkable as it had before. He called it the Awakening Stone. "The Awakening Stone," Hermione repeated slowly. "He made it. Specifically for whoever came through the door." Harry looked at it, then pocketed it, and the warmth didn't diminish. It was part of him now, sitting alongside the thing in his chest the way a second instrument joins a melody already in progress. He was very annoyed about how late I am. The stone communicated personality?" Hermione asked. "Very clearly," Harry said. "What did he say?" Ron asked. Harry thought about the 1,000-year-old map of magical Britain he was now carrying in his blood, the original framework, the corruptions, the route to undoing them. He thought about the Sorcerer's Sovereign Compact and the Wisengamot seat and the sealed agreements that the Ministry had unknowingly built its power inside of. He thought about Voldemort and Dumbledore and all the chess pieces already on the board. He said, Harry told them, that we have a lot of work to do. They filed the claim at 4 in the afternoon, in Ragnarok's office on the deepest administrative level of Gringotts, Harry's signature on parchment that smelled like a very old library and somehow felt more permanent than stone. Ragnarok sealed it with the Gringotts mark and an additional seal that Harry recognized as the Ambrosius sigil from the vault door. 2 goblin witnesses signed beneath. The whole process took 20 minutes and felt like moving a mountain, if mountains were made of paperwork and moved very quietly. "It will reach the Ministry by morning," Ragnarok said. "Good," Harry said. "How long do you think before Dumbledore hears about it?" "Before noon," Ragnarok said. "And Lucius Malfoy?" A flicker of something passed across Ragnarok's face. "Before Dumbledore." Harry nodded. He'd expected that. The Malfoys were on the Hogwarts Board of Governors. They had contacts at the Ministry built through decades of careful cultivation and aggressive generosity with the family gold. Information moved to them the way water moved downhill, inevitably, quickly, and without asking permission. "Malfoy is going to be a problem," Ron said, not happily, on the stairs back to the main hall. He'd been quiet for most of the last hour, which was Ron's mode when he was thinking hard. "He's got his hands in everything." "He does," Harry agreed. "And he's smart. Don't underestimate that part." "I never underestimate the people who are actively terrible," Ron said with feeling. "It's how they get you." Hermione had her notes out and was writing while walking, which was impressive and also slightly concerning given the stairs. "The Wisengamot seat is the key one," she said. "Socially, politically, legally, if Harry claims the Ambrosius seat, it gives him a vote in Wisengamot proceedings, which means criminal trials, which means if Dumbledore tries what he tried with Buckbeak," Harry said, "I can vote against it. And appeal any decision made by the Wisengamot directly to, Harry, the compact says you can appeal to the Crown." "I know. The Muggle Crown. The actual British monarch." "I know. The Ministry will have a collective stroke." "I know," Harry said, for the 3rd time, and there was enough warmth in it that Hermione stopped walking and looked at him. "You're looking forward to this," she said. Not accusatory. Genuinely surprised. "Someone should look forward to it," he said. "Someone should be willing to walk directly into the middle of everything that's wrong with the wizarding world and refuse to walk back out until it looks different. Merlin built the foundations. They've been misused for centuries. I'm not going to spend my entire life fighting Voldemort on everyone else's timeline while the system that lets Voldemorts exist stays exactly as it is." Hermione looked at him for a long moment. Ron looked at him too. The main hall of Gringotts was busy around them, transactions and goblins and the distant sound of minecarts, and Harry stood in the middle of it at 13 years old with Merlin's stone warm in his pocket and 1,000 years of magical history reorganizing itself in his blood, and he thought, "I know what I'm doing. For the first time. I actually know." "Okay," Hermione said. She closed her notes. "Okay. Then we're doing this." "All of it?" Ron said. "All of it," she confirmed, the way she confirmed answers on exams, with absolute conviction. Ron grinned, quick and bright and entirely Ron. "Brilliant," he said. "I've been bored anyway." They walked out of Gringotts into the late afternoon of Diagon Alley, the summer crowd thinning now as shops began to close, the last of the golden light catching the white marble steps and warming them. The goblin guards inclined their heads again as Harry passed. He nodded back. Behind him, the greatest collection of accumulated magical knowledge in history sat in a sealed chamber 11 floors underground, waiting. Ahead of him, the Ministry of Magic was about to receive a piece of parchment that was going to cause a very specific kind of chaos. He thought about Merlin again, the portrait, the stone, the way the vault had felt like something that had been held at exactly the right tension for exactly the right amount of time. He thought about what the stone had said. Surviving death was not the remarkable part. The remarkable part was what you chose to do with the life on the other side. He pulled the awakening stone from his pocket and turned it over once in his fingers, warm and plain and impossible, and then pocketed it again. Tomorrow, the ministry would know his name. His real name, both halves of it, the one that had been sealed away in stone for 1,000 years. Pater Ambrosius. He was looking forward to seeing what they did with that. Chapter 3, The Tournament and the Throne. The ministry's response arrived in 3 waves, which Harry thought was actually quite organized for an institution that had spent the last decade pretending Voldemort didn't exist. The first wave was a letter, formal, ministry-headed, signed by someone called Amos Diggory in the Department of Magical Cooperation, which was apparently who they'd assigned to the problem of Harry Potter Ambrosius. The letter used words like irregularity and requires verification and historical anomalies of this nature in the particular tone of someone who had been handed a problem they didn't understand and asked to make it go away without disturbing anyone important. Harry read it over breakfast at the Burrow, where he'd relocated for the last weeks of August at Mrs. Weasley's insistence, and wrote back a very polite reply that included, as attachments, 17 pages of Gringotts-certified legal documentation and a brief note suggesting that Mr. Diggory might want to escalate. The second wave was Dumbledore, who arrived at the Burrow 3 days later in the particular way Dumbledore arrived places, as if he'd been there for slightly longer than the moment you noticed him, settling into the kitchen chair across from Harry with a lemon drop and a look that was warmly careful in a way that had stopped working on Harry sometime around the awakening stone. They talked for an hour. Harry was entirely honest about what he'd found, what he'd claimed, and what he intended. Dumbledore listened with the deep attention he gave everything, asked several questions that were very good questions, and offered several pieces of guidance that were also very good and which Harry noted and then set aside, because Dumbledore's guidance was always technically excellent and structurally designed to keep Harry moving along a path that Dumbledore had already laid. He wasn't walking that path anymore. The third wave was silence, which was the most alarming response by far. The ministry stopped sending letters. Dumbledore stopped visiting. For 3 weeks, nothing. Harry spent those 3 weeks in Merlin's vault, working through the journals with Hermione, drilling the old magic with a focus that made his previous study habits look like suggestions. He learned the original framework of magical law the way you learn a language by living in it, total immersion, constant practice, the meaning building itself in him word by word until he stopped translating and started thinking in it directly. Merlin's spell construction was nothing like what was taught at Hogwarts. It didn't follow the wand-word intent triangle. It worked from intention directly to reality, using the practitioner's own magical signature as both medium and instrument, and the more Harry practiced it the more the old magic and his existing skill set fused into something that didn't have a category yet. Then the Quidditch World Cup happened. Then the port key to Hogwarts. Then Professor Moody, who Harry clocked as wrong within the first 2 days of term, with a certainty he didn't second-guess, and then the Triwizard Tournament announcement, which was when the silence ended and the third wave arrived. Not a letter this time. Lucius Malfoy, in the flesh, at the Halloween feast. He wasn't supposed to be there. That was the first thing Harry noticed, not his presence in the Great Hall exactly, because parents and ministry officials attended the feast for the Goblet of Fire ceremony, but his position. Lucius Malfoy was standing behind the head table, not beside the other visiting parents or officials, but behind, in the shadow of the space between the staff chairs, with the precise casual authority of a man who had arranged his own placing. He was watching the students file in with the expression of someone reviewing an inventory. His eyes found Harry across the great hall and stayed there. Harry looked back. He didn't look away first. After 5 full seconds, Lucius Malfoy smiled slightly and returned his attention to the room at large, and Harry turned back to his dinner and thought, there it is. Dumbledore announced the Triwizard Tournament. The Great Hall reacted the way it always did to news of rule-bending and danger, with enthusiasm calibrated precisely to age, the older students calculating their chances, the younger ones already making plans to circumvent the age restriction. Harry ate his roast chicken and listened and felt the evening click into place around him like puzzle pieces finding their positions. Then Dumbledore announced the age line. 17 and above only. An aging potion wouldn't work. The name submitted must be the genuine magical signature of the submitting student. Harry put down his fork. He wasn't thinking about entering. That wasn't the thing. The thing was the phrase genuine magical signature, which resonated with something in Merlin's journals, a passage about the Triwizard Tournament's original design, the compacts built into the Goblet of Fire itself, what happened when a name was submitted that didn't belong to the submitting witch or wizard. He pulled out the awakening stone under the table, his thumb finding its familiar warmth, and thought, someone's going to put my name in that goblet. And the goblet is going to spit it back out. Because the Goblet of Fire was old. Older than the tournament. It predated the ministry by centuries and its binding magic worked on the same layer as the old framework, Merlin's layer, the foundational layer, and the Sorcerer's Sovereign Compact was already filed, already registered, and already woven into that layer as law. No magical binding could compel the Ambrosius heir without their explicit consent. Not the goblet. Not a portkey. Not a wand. Nothing. Harry looked at the goblet on its stone plinth, fire burning blue-white in the dimness, and thought, go ahead and try. He didn't say any of this to Ron and Hermione. Not yet. He set it to the stone in his pocket, which was warm enough to be almost conversational. The champions were selected 3 days later. Cedric Diggory for Hogwarts. Harry caught Mrs. Diggory's tearful joy from across the hall and felt a genuine warmth for Cedric, who was decent in a way that didn't announce itself, who held doors and thanked people and would have made an excellent champion under any circumstances. Victor Crumb for Durmstrang, massive, impassive, already the most famous 17-year-old wizard in the world, and clearly bored by it in the specific way that very talented people got bored by fame before they'd earned anything beyond talent. Fleur Delacour for Beauxbatons. Harry's first impression was the deliberately understated elegance of someone who knew exactly what she was and had grown tired of other people's reactions to it. Then Dumbledore reached into the goblet. Then he pulled out a 4th slip of parchment. Harry was watching Lucius Malfoy's face when it happened. Not the parchment. Malfoy's face. He wanted to see the moment of satisfaction, the confirmation of something set in motion. He saw it, a flicker, quickly controlled, the specific micro-expression of a plan arriving on schedule. Harry Potter, Dumbledore said. The hall erupted. Harry stayed in his seat. He did not stand up. He did not walk to the front. He sat with his elbows on the table and waited for the noise to settle slightly, and then, into the relative quiet, he said, at conversational volume that somehow carried, no. People near him heard it and went quiet. The quiet spread. Dumbledore looked at him. Harry, I didn't submit my name, Harry said. Still conversational. Someone submitted it for me. Which is forgery of a magical signature, which is a ministry-level offense. He stood up now, not quickly, not dramatically, just standing up the way you stand up when you've decided something. And beyond that, the goblet's binding contract can't compel the Ambrosius heir without explicit consent. It's in the original compact. Filed at Gringotts. Registered with the Ministry as of August 17th. He looked at Dumbledore. You know this. The hall was very quiet now. The kind of quiet that had weight. The rules of the tournament state, the Ministry official, Bartemius Crouch, started. The tournament's rules are superseded in this case by a compact that predates the tournament by 4 centuries, Harry said, pleasantly. He turned his gaze to Crouch, who was a man built for authority in the way that certain buildings were, all facade and very little foundation. I'd recommend verifying that with your legal department. They'll have received the documentation. This is highly irregular, Crouch said. Yes, Harry agreed. I've been told that. He looked at the parchment slip still in Dumbledore's hand. His name, written in someone else's magical signature. I'd also like to point out, for the record, that the fact my name came out at all suggests the goblet found something in it to work with, which means whoever submitted it is capable of mimicking my magical signature, which is a significantly more alarming problem than the tournament situation. He looked directly at the space where Moody was standing. Wouldn't you say, Professor? Moody's magical eye whirred and fixed on him. Behind it, behind whoever was wearing Moody's face, Harry felt something shift. Recognition. Recalibration. Good. Let them recalibrate. The boy has a point, said Crumb unexpectedly, in his deep, slightly accented English. He'd been watching the whole exchange with something that might have been respect. If the contract cannot bind him, it cannot bind him. The goblet's magic confirms it, the slip came out wrong. Wrong how? Fleur asked. The parchment is cold, Crumb said simply. Look at it. The other 3 burned warm when they were selected. His is cold. The goblet rejected the binding. Dumbledore looked at the parchment slip. He looked at Harry. His expression was extraordinarily complicated, pride, concern, and the specific look of a chess player watching a piece move independently for the first time. He's right, he said quietly. The parchment is cold. In the silence that followed, Harry sat back down, picked up his fork, and resumed eating his pudding, which was an excellent treacle tart and had been cooling while the drama unfolded. So, he said, to no one in particular. What's for second course? The fallout took a week to settle into its permanent shape. Cedric remained the sole Hogwarts champion, which Harry was genuinely pleased about. Cedric's face when it became clear that Harry wasn't competing had gone through relief, guilt about the relief, and then a kind of open gratitude that Harry acknowledged with a nod. The 3 champions went off to prepare. Harry went back to his normal schedule, which was abnormal by any objective measure but felt settled to him now. Lucius Malfoy requested a meeting with him through official channels, a formal letter, ministry stamped, citing his role as Hogwarts board governor. Harry replied accepting the meeting and suggesting the Hogwarts library, which was a choice that communicated several things at once. Not the headmaster's office, not a ministry location, not anywhere that belonged to anyone else's authority. The library was neutral ground and Harry knew it better than Malfoy would, which was the kind of small advantage worth taking. Malfoy arrived on a Saturday morning in early November, moving through the library with the ease of someone who had spent his whole life in beautiful old rooms and knew how to use them, how to position himself by the window so the light caught the silver in his hair and the quality of his robes simultaneously. He was, Harry had to acknowledge, an extremely competent performer of the role of Lucius Malfoy. He did it so well that most people forgot it was a performance. Harry was already seated when he arrived, the awakening stone on the table between them like a paperweight, Merlin's fourth journal open beside it. Malfoy looked at both objects with carefully managed curiosity and took the chair opposite. "Mr. Potter," he said. "Mr. Malfoy," Harry said. "Or should I use the Wiesengamat honorific? I can never remember if lords still prefer it in informal settings." A slight pause. "Either is fine," Malfoy said. His voice was smooth as river stone and about as warm. "I appreciate you agreeing to meet." "I was curious," Harry said honestly. "You're intelligent." "The goblet plan was good, not good enough, but good. You correctly identified that the binding would attempt to hold even if it couldn't compel, and you probably expected I wouldn't know about the compact in time to cite it at the feast." Malfoy was quiet for exactly 1 second. "You're 13, he said, in a tone that wasn't quite a question. "I've been told that," Harry said. "What would you like to discuss?" Malfoy leaned back in his chair, crossed one leg over the other, and made the decision to abandon the prepared approach, which Harry respected. It meant he was willing to be direct when the situation required it. "The Ambrosius claim," he said. "I'd like to understand your intentions." "My intentions are in the filing," Harry said. "It's public documentation. The filing is legal language. I'm asking what you actually intend." Harry looked at him. He thought about Merlin's journals, specifically the passages about the old families of magical Britain, the way they'd evolved from the original framework's partners into its landlords, taking the protections built for everyone and deciding they were entitled to them exclusively. He thought about the Wiesengamat as it currently stood, 2/3 composed of exactly the kind of old money families who had the most to lose from the original framework being reinstated. The original compacts, Harry said, were built on a principle of balance. Not equality, because magical ability isn't equal and pretending it is doesn't help anyone. Balance. Each magical community, wizards, creatures, the land itself, had standing. Had rights. Had recourse. He picked up the awakening stone, turned it once, set it back. Those rights were eroded. Not all at once, not by any single decision, but by a few centuries of small choices made by people who would have described every single one as reasonable and necessary. "You intend to restore them," Malfoy said. Flat. Unreadable. "Some of them," Harry said. "The ones that matter." "And the old families?" "The ones whose current standing depends on the existing structure." "Depends on which part of the existing structure," Harry said. "If your power comes from talent, from work, from genuine service to magical Britain, you've got nothing to worry about. If it comes from an interpretation of historical rights that the historical record doesn't actually support," he shrugged. "You might want to start thinking about what else you've got." Malfoy studied him for a long time. It was an assessment in the fullest sense, the kind that went past the surface and tried to find the mechanism underneath, the thing that was actually running the operation. Harry let him look. He had nothing to hide. "You realize," Malfoy said finally, "that there are forces in play that would find your inheritance extremely useful as a tool." "Yes," Harry said. "Voldemort. Not you know who. Not he who must not be named. Voldemort, out loud, in the library, in a normal volume, the way you'd name any person you intended to deal with directly." Something moved in Malfoy's eyes. Something that Harry thought, with interest, might have been fear dressed as composure. "He will come back," Malfoy said. "I know," Harry said. "And when he does, the Ambrosius inheritance will be the first thing he tries to claim or destroy. You understand that?" "What I understand," Harry said carefully, "is that you're trying to work out whether you could manage me before you decide how afraid of me you should be." He leaned forward slightly. "You can't. And you should be somewhat afraid, but not because I want to hurt you or your family. Because I'm going to change the framework you've built your entire life inside, and that's frightening, and I don't think you're wrong to find it frightening. He met Malfoy's eyes. But I'm going to do it anyway. Lucius Malfoy looked at him for a very long moment. Then he stood, smoothed his robes with one precise motion, and said, "You are nothing like I expected." "I know," Harry said. "Have a good weekend, Mr. Malfoy." Malfoy left. Harry watched him go, then picked up Merlin's journal and went back to reading. 3 tables over, Hermione appeared from behind a bookshelf where she'd very definitely not been listening, sat down, and said, "I wasn't eavesdropping." "Of course not," Harry said. "I was researching. Nearby." "Obviously. He's going to be a problem," she said, in a different tone now, the working tone, the one that meant she'd already started building a response to a threat she'd identified. "He's going to try to be a problem," Harry said. "There's a difference." She looked at him. "You're frighteningly calm about all of this." "One of us has to be," he said. "You're anxious enough for both of us." "I'm thorough," she said, with dignity. "You were hiding behind a shelf eavesdropping on my meeting with a Death Eater." "I was," she stopped. "Fine. How did it go?" "Well," Harry said. "I think he went away having learned something." "What?" He turned a page in the journal. "That I'm not afraid of him." The first task of the Triwizard Tournament came on a grey November morning, the grounds of Hogwarts cold and still, frost on the grass, the mountains behind the lake looking close the way they got before snow. Harry wasn't competing, but he had a standing invite from Dumbledore to observe from the judges' platform, which he'd accepted because observing from the judges' platform meant being present for whatever happened, and Harry had the specific feeling about today that things were going to happen. He sat between McGonagall and an empty chair that was supposed to have Moody in it. Moody was with the champions in the preparation tent, which Harry noted because it was unusual for a defense teacher to be with the competition rather than in a neutral observation role. He watched the arena below, a rough enclosure of stone barriers with the Hungarian horntail chained at its center, and thought about Cedric inside the tent, who was probably nervous and who had also been quietly visiting Harry in the library over the last 3 weeks. Not officially. Not for any named reason. But Cedric sat down and asked questions about the old magic with the open intelligence of someone who absorbed things quickly and didn't perform ignorance to seem approachable, and Harry had told him what he could. He hadn't told him the tasks. He didn't know the specific tasks. But he'd told him principles, the way the old magic responded to intent rather than form, the way understanding what you wanted at a fundamental level produced better results than memorizing the correct wand movement. He'd told him that most of what Hogwarts taught was scaffolding and the real structure was underneath it. Whether any of that would help with a dragon remained to be seen. Fleur went first. The common Welsh green gave her more trouble than the task demanded. She put it in a partial trance with a complex enchantment Harry recognized as a derivation of something in one of the older texts, got her egg, but took a tail strike on her way out that singed her robes. The judges scored her reasonably. Crumb went second. He went straight at the Chinese fireball with exactly the approach you'd expect from someone whose whole development as a wizard had been offensive. He took it on directly, powerful and confident, conjunctivitis curse that blinded it enough to maneuver. The dragon thrashed, crushed 3 of its own eggs. He got his golden egg, but lost points for the egg loss. He didn't look particularly troubled about this. Cedric went third. Harry watched. Cedric stood at the entrance to the arena for a moment longer than the other 2 had, and Harry could see even from the judge's platform that he was doing something, not wand movements, not visible preparation, just standing very still with his eyes closed. Then he walked in. He transfigured a stone barrier into a wall of dense fog that the Swedish shortsnout couldn't navigate by sight. Then he moved through it by feel, by intent, the way Harry had described, knowing where he was going without looking for landmarks, moving like he'd already arrived and was just catching up to himself. He got the egg clean. No contact. The dragon turned circles in the fog, confused, while Cedric walked out the other side and held up the golden egg to Scattered, and then building, and then thunderous applause. From the judge's table, Dumbledore watched Cedric and then looked very deliberately at Harry and said nothing. Harry said nothing back. The scores were high, Cedric tied with Krum at the top. The crowd was pleased. In the recovery tent afterward, Harry shook Cedric's hand and Cedric shook his with the grip of someone who wanted to say something specific and hadn't worked out how, and finally settled on, the fog. The fog, Harry agreed. How did you know about the fog? I didn't, Harry said. You knew about the fog. I just mentioned that knowing where you're going is more useful than seeing where you're going. Cedric looked at him. You're a strange person, Harry. Yeah, Harry said. I know. December arrived with the announcement of the Yule Ball, which Ron immediately turned into a 3-week campaign of anxiety entirely disproportionate to the situation, and Harry found himself having to navigate his best friend's romantic distress while simultaneously managing an ongoing legal dispute with the Ministry of Magic and working through Merlin's 37th journal, which was the most technically complex and also the most personally revealing, covering the last years of Merlin's life in a handwriting that had gotten smaller and more urgent as the pages progressed. He asked Parvati Patil to the ball, who accepted with good grace and genuine cheerfulness, and that was that. He wasn't going to agonize about it. What he was going to agonize about, quietly, in the way he agonized about things, which was more thinking than agonizing, was Moody. He'd been watching Moody since September with the patient focus he was learning to apply to things that felt wrong, and by December the wrongness had become so specific that he could almost name its shape. Moody was brilliant. His teaching was genuinely excellent, functional and practical and aimed at real outcomes rather than theoretical understanding. But there were moments, micro-moments, the kind that most people missed, where he looked at Harry with an interest that had nothing to do with teaching. A calculating quality. A measurement being made and recalculated. Also his magical signature was off. Harry had become sensitive to magical signatures the way a musician becomes sensitive to pitch, unconsciously, accurately, and with a physical discomfort when something was wrong. Moody's signature had a quality that reminded him of something he'd read in Merlin's journals about polyjuice potion at extended duration. The way a sustained transformation left traces that a sufficiently sensitive observer could detect in the maintained enchantment, a faint wobble in the edges of the person like a painting that had been painted over another painting, the original showing through in specific light. He needed more time to be certain. And he needed, more importantly, to know who was under the face if he was right. The Yule Ball arrived in a blaze of silver and blue decorations and McGonagall teaching 4th years to waltz with the contained suffering of someone who loved dancing privately and found having to teach it publicly one of existence's deeper ironies. Harry danced adequately, talked to Cedric and Fleur and Krum, who turned out to be a genuinely interesting person when not performing Victor Krum, quieter, more thoughtful, with a dry observational humor that emerged once he decided he was among people who could handle it. Hermione arrived at the ball on Victor Krum's arm. Ron's face went through approximately 11 distinct emotional stages in 4 seconds. Harry, who had seen this coming since October when Krum had started appearing in the library section where Hermione worked, quietly positioned himself between Ron and the worst version of whatever Ron was about to say, and held a conversation with Ron for the next 15 minutes about Quidditch that was entirely sincere on Harry's part and entirely automatic on Ron's, which got them both through the worst of the initial dinner service without incident. Afterward, in the garden, because the ball ran hot and gardens at midnight in December solved that problem, Harry sat on a stone bench and looked at the lake, the surface of which was doing something beautiful and slightly eerie, the mere people below it visible occasionally as moving light. Cedric found him there, alone, after dropping Cho Chang at the steps. "You knew," Cedric said, sitting beside him. "No context." They were past context at this point. "About what specifically?" Harry asked. "The tournament. Someone put your name in. You weren't surprised." "I was prepared," Harry said. "There's a difference." "And whoever submitted it, do you know who it was?" Harry looked at the lake. "I have a strong suspicion," he said carefully. "I'm working on certainty." "Moody," Cedric said. Harry turned to look at him. Cedric met his gaze steadily. "I'm a Hufflepuff," Cedric said. "Not a Gryffindor. I watch people rather than charging at them, and I've been watching Moody since term started." He paused. "He's not Moody." "No," Harry agreed. "He's not." "Who is he?" "I don't know yet." He turned back to the lake. "But the signature is Polyjuice, held long-term. Someone with enough skill to sustain it. Someone with a reason to be inside Hogwarts specifically at this specific moment." He thought about the goblet, about Voldemort, about the graveyard that Trelawney had predicted in a moment of genuine prophecy last year, a specific vision involving a stone building and a rebirth. He thought about the timeline and what all its moving pieces added up to. "Someone is building something," he said. "I know the shape of it. I need to know the last piece before I move." "And when you know?" Harry picked up a flat stone from the garden path and skipped it across the lake. It skipped 6 times, the 6th skip sending out a ring of silver light where it broke the surface, and in the depths something large and curious moved toward the disturbance and then away. "Then I stop it," he said simply. "Or I let it try to happen on my terms, which gives me more information and them less than they expect." He looked at Cedric. "I need you to stay close to me in the second task." "I know you don't need my help, I'll take it anyway," Cedric said. No argument, no performance of independence. Just the easy practicality of someone who understood alliance. "What's the second task?" "Something underwater," Harry said. "The lake. Something they'll take from us that we have to retrieve." Cedric was quiet for a moment. "How do you know?" "The first task was about power," Harry said. "The second task is about something more personal. The goblet's binding magic follows a specific structure: strength, sacrifice, endurance. 3 challenges, 3 qualities. The sacrifice task is always water, always involves what you'd miss most." He looked at Cedric. "Do you know what you'd miss most?" The question landed differently than Harry meant it, and they both felt it. Cedric looked toward the castle, toward the light from the ball, where Cho would be dancing with someone else now, and his jaw set slightly. "Yes," he said quietly. "I know." "Then we prepare for that," Harry said. "Both of us." The night settled around them, cold and clear, stars hard and bright above the castle. Harry stayed in the garden for another half hour after Cedric went back inside, sitting with the stone in his pocket and the thing in his chest doing its steady work, processing and preparing. He thought about what Merlin's journals had said about the point at which ancient magic stopped being a thing you used and started being a thing you were. The integration, Merlin called it. The point at which you stop reaching for it. The point at which it breathes when you breathe. He sat in the December garden and breathed. The stone in his pocket was warm. He broke the Moody situation open in January, 3 weeks before the second task. He'd been collecting evidence the way Hermione collected references, systematically, from multiple angles, each piece cross-referenced against the others until the picture became undeniable. The Polyjuice signature. The specific quality of interest in Harry's name being drawn from the goblet. A visit to Moody's office under the invisibility cloak that revealed, in the large magical trunk that sat against the wall, a magical resonance he recognized from Merlin's journals as the signature of a false bottom under sustained enchantment. Someone was living in that trunk. He went to Dumbledore. Not because he needed Dumbledore's validation, he'd left that need behind in the headmaster's office in 3rd year, but because what happened next needed to happen with witnesses who had institutional authority, and Dumbledore was still the most powerful institutional authority in British magical life. He laid it out in the headmaster's office, concisely, without editorializing. Moody is Polyjuice. The trunk has a false bottom. The real Moody is probably in the trunk. Whoever is walking around in his face put my name in the goblet and is operating inside this school on behalf of Voldemort, whose return is imminent and specifically targeted at me. Dumbledore listened to all of it. Then he asked one question: "How certain are you?" "Completely," Harry said. They went to Moody's office. McGonagall came, and Snape, and Flitwick, and Lupin, who had been retained at Harry's explicit request despite Snape's ongoing objections. They opened the trunk. Alastor Moody, the real one, gaunt, thinner than his reputation suggested, but alive, was at the bottom, under months of magical confinement, and was furious about it in the particular way of people who had survived by being furious about things for a very long time. The fake Moody, caught mid-transition as the polyjuice wore off, turned out to be Bartemius Crouch Jr., who had been officially dead for over a year and who looked at Harry as the polyjuice finished failing with an expression of absolute disbelief. "You're a child," Crouch said. "Everyone keeps saying that," Harry said. Dumbledore stunned Crouch with the efficiency of someone who had been performing emergency magic for 70 years and had no patience for theater. In the aftermath, the Ministry summoned, the situation being managed, real Moody being taken to St. Mungo's, Snape stood against the wall and looked at Harry with the expression he'd been wearing since September, the one that Harry had learned to read as Snape trying to reconcile what he expected with what he was seeing. "How long have you known?" Snape asked. "Since November," Harry said. "And you waited?" "I waited until I had complete evidence," Harry said. "If I'd moved too early, there'd have been nothing to take to the Ministry. Crouch would have denied it and we'd have had no proof of Voldemort's involvement. But now," Snape said slowly, "you have a Death Eater in Ministry custody who will, under Veritaserum, confirm everything. Including the plan for my capture at the end of the tournament," Harry said. "Which means the graveyard. Which means the ritual. Which means," he paused. "Voldemort's return is going to happen. We don't stop it by catching Crouch early. We stop it by being ready for it." Snape stared at him for 5 solid seconds. "You planned this," he said. "Merlin's journals have a lot to say about the difference between preventing a crisis and being prepared for one," Harry said. He picked up his bag. "Professor Dumbledore, I'll need a full briefing on the specifics of the Riddle family bloodline by end of week. The ritual requires it and I want to understand the mechanism before we deal with the result." He walked out into the corridor. Behind him, he heard Dumbledore say something to Snape in a low voice, and Snape reply in the tone he used when something had surprised him past his capacity to be unpleasant about it. Harry smiled at the flagstones and kept walking. The second task was the lake, as predicted. Something taken from each champion. For Cedric, it was Cho, asleep in the depths along with the Beauxbatons girl, Ron, and a small Durmstrang student Harry didn't know. They'd used a sleeping enchantment that was triggered at the start of the task. Harry hit the water with gillyweed. He'd worked with Neville all January on this specific situation, because Neville's understanding of magical herbology was as close to Merlin's botanical magic as the modern curriculum got, and the gillyweed let him breathe below the surface while the old magic let him move through the water in a way that had nothing to do with swimming. He moved by intent, by knowing where he was going rather than looking for it, the same way Cedric had moved through the fog. He found the anchoring point in 12 minutes, which was fast enough that he arrived before any of the other champions and had a brief, tense negotiation with the Mer people entirely in their own language, which he was discovering he understood on the same underlying principle as Parseltongue. The old magic touched all of it, the deep languages, the creature tongues that predated wand magic. He got Ron free. He waited while Cedric arrived, fast and efficient with a bubblehead charm, and got Cho. He waited for Fleur, who'd been stopped by Grindylows, and when she didn't appear inside what felt like the right window he cut the remaining 2 hostages' bindings loose himself and surfaced with all 4. Fleur, breathless on the bank when Harry emerged, looked at him with an expression that was, for Fleur Delacour, something close to undone. They are both, they're fine," Harry said, wringing lakewater out of his hair. "You'd have got there." "I would not," she said, with the directness of someone who'd rather be honest than gracious. "The Grindylows. I would not have got past them in time." "Then we're even," Harry said. "Because you'd have done something for me if I needed it." He looked at her properly. "Right?" She studied him. "Yes," she said, simply. "I would." The judges scored him high for the hostage retrieval. Dumbledore's scoring made it a first-place finish, and Harry accepted the points with equanimity, then went to find Neville, who deserved the credit for the gillyweed and who had been standing at the bank the whole hour looking like he'd spent 60 minutes holding his breath. "Thank you," Harry told him. Neville's response was brief and genuine and slightly overwhelmed. Harry felt the old magic hum warmly in his chest, that familiar pulse, and thought, this is the work. Not the power. The people. He thought Merlin would have agreed with that. He thought Merlin would have been glad. Chapter 4, Fire and Old Names. The third task arrived in June with the particular quality of things that have been coming for a long time, the air around them already changed, the landscape already rearranged in preparation, the moment itself almost anticlimactic when it finally got there because everyone had been living in its shadow for months. Harry had been living in its shadow since third year. Since before that, really. Since the night in October when he was 15 months old and something had cracked open in a nursery in Godric's Hollow that was still, 12 years later, reverberating. He stood at the entrance to the maze on a warm June evening and thought about that infant in the crib, and about the crack in the stone, and about everything that had moved through that crack and settled into him over the last 9 months, and he thought, we're going to end this tonight. Not the way anyone planned. But we're going to end it. The maze was enormous, hedges 20 feet high, dense and dark, charmed to move and shift, full of creatures and curses planted by what had been moody and was now a ministry or waiting for whatever happened at the end of this. Cedric was the other champion inside with him. Fleur had withdrawn after a second task injury flared up. Crumb, standing at the entrance beside Harry in those last seconds before the cannon fired, had looked at the maze with the expression of someone who'd decided something. "Good luck," Crumb said. He said it to both of them but his eyes were on Harry. "You too," Harry said. The cannon fired. He moved through the maze fast, using the old magic as a compass rather than a wand, feeling for the wrongness of active enchantments the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm, the subtle heaviness of something waiting. He disabled 2 curses before triggering them, stunned a blast-ended script by connecting to what passed for its decision-making process, which was primitive but sufficient, and navigated 2 deliberate dead ends by understanding that the maze's own magic was partially constructed on the old framework, which meant it had a structure he could read from inside it. He was at the Triwizard Cup in 30 minutes. He stood in the center of the final clearing and looked at it, gold, gleaming, sitting on a stone plinth with an aura of magic around it that pulsed like a heartbeat. The Goblet's Cup. The tournament's end. He could feel the portkey enchantment on it from 15 feet away. Not the standard portkey signature, not the specific magical frequency of a legitimate transport charm, but something layered under it, darker, older in the wrong way. Old like rot is old. Old like something that had started as one thing and been corrupted into another. He knew this signature from Merlin's journals. He knew what it led to. The graveyard. He walked toward the cup slowly, feeling every layer of the enchantment as he approached, mapping it the way he'd been mapping magic for 9 months now, its purpose, its destination, its binding mechanism, its failure points. The destination was fixed. Voldemort's people had done solid work. The binding was on contact, which meant anyone who grabbed the cup without specific countermeasures would be taken. The failure point was the same one everything built outside the original framework had, it relied on the person touching it not knowing what it was. Harry knew what it was. He heard Cedric arrive in the clearing behind him, slightly out of breath, and held up one hand without turning around. Cedric stopped. "It's a portkey," Harry said. "To a graveyard. Voldemort's waiting there with a resurrection ritual." A beat of silence. "How long have you known?" Cedric asked. "Since we caught Crouch." Harry turned to look at him. In the maze's half-dark, the cup's gold light catching Cedric's face, he looked older than 18. He looked like someone who had been growing into something serious all year and had arrived. "I've been letting it run because I needed to be there. I need to be at the ritual. Not to stop it," he added, "but to be present when it happens." "You want Voldemort to come back," Cedric said slowly. I want Voldemort to come back on ground where I'm already standing, Harry said. That's different. Cedric looked at the cup for a long moment. The maze settled around them, the hedges breathing in the warm summer air. Somewhere deeper inside, Harry could hear nothing, which meant either Crumb hadn't gone this far or the maze had separated them completely. What do you need from me? Cedric asked. Stay back when I touch it, Harry said. I'm going to modify the portkey return. It will bring both of us home, but it'll take 30 seconds that might feel like longer. He paused. You should know that what you're about to see is going to be, I'm coming with you, Cedric said. Cedric, I know what you're going to say and I'm coming. He moved to stand beside Harry, shoulder to shoulder, facing the cup. You can't tell me to stay behind. That's not how this works. Harry looked at him. He thought about the lake, about Cho's face when Cedric surfaced with her, about the way Cedric had sat on the garden bench in December and said I know what I'd miss most with his jaw set like a decision. He thought about Merlin's journals, the passages about the allies a sorcerer built not through command but through the quality of what they stood for, the people who chose to stand beside you because they understood what you were for. All right, he said. Stay close. He reached out and touched the Triwizard Cup. The graveyard arrived with the particular violence of poorly calibrated portkey travel, the wrenching pull, the spinning dark, the hard landing on ground that was cold even in June, the smell of damp earth and old stone. Harry landed on his feet. Cedric stumbled and caught himself, and they were immediately back to back, wands up, before the world had finished resolving around them. The graveyard was old, a village churchyard, the headstones worn and tilted at various angles, yew trees at the corners dark against a clouded sky. In the center, a large stone cauldron that was already lit, the fire beneath it dark green in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Near the cauldron, a massive stone grave marker, and beside it a small, robed figure cradling something in its arms that moved. Peter Pettigrew. Wormtail. Harry recognized him even in the dark from the year at the Shrieking Shack, the pale, twitching quality of him, the fear that radiated off of him like a physical thing. The thing he was cradling was small and wrapped and Harry could feel its magical signature from 20 feet away like a match held too close to skin. Voldemort. Infant-shaped, parasitic, barely contained, but unmistakably him. The dark marks magic. The signature of someone who had shredded their soul into pieces and found the process changed them in ways they couldn't fully reverse. Harry lowered his wand. Not because he wasn't ready to use it. Because he understood, suddenly and completely, what Merlin's journals had been building toward for all these months. The passage he'd read and reread in February, the one that had felt theoretical until this exact moment, the proper response to corrupted magic is not more of the same. You do not shout down a fire with fire. You return the fire to its source and let the source decide what it was always meant to be. Wormtail looked at him. You're supposed to be afraid, he said, and the observation was so genuinely confused that it was almost pathetic. I know, Harry said. Sorry to disappoint. The thing in Wormtail's arms moved. The voice that came from it was recognizable, thin, high, not fully formed but carrying the specific resonance of someone who had been practicing authority for 40 years and found it impossible to stop. Kill the other one, Voldemort said. Bring me the boy. Wormtail put the wrapped Voldemort down, carefully, reverently, the way you'd set down something that might hurt you if you dropped it, and raised his wand at Cedric. Harry moved between them. He didn't use a spell. He extended his left hand, felt the old magic rise through him the way it had been rising all year, the full thing now, the unsealed version, every window open and every light on, and what came out of his palm wasn't a spell or a charm or any classification that Hogwarts had a textbook for. It was the old magic's most basic function, the one Merlin had described in his journals as the foundation response, the thing that happened when the bloodline met an active magical threat and chose to address it directly. It was, simply, no. Not a shield. Not a repelling charm. Not a barrier of any kind. Just the fundamental assertion of will from the deepest layer of magical reality, the layer that the old framework ran on, the layer where all magic ultimately originated, and from that layer, the statement that this person is not going to be harmed here, not today, not by this. Wormtail's wand arm stopped. Not blocked, not restrained, it just stopped, the way a river stops at a dam, the motion encountering something it couldn't pass through and failing. He looked at his own arm with the expression of a man whose own body had filed an objection. That's not, he started. I know, Harry said. He lowered his hand. The feeling subsided to its resting state, that warm steadiness. He turned to the cauldron and the robed, wrapped thing on the ground and said, clearly, I'm going to give you a choice. From the wrapped thing, a sound that might have been a laugh. A choice. You're not back yet, Harry said. You're barely here. You're mostly in tension at the moment, which is the most honest I think you've ever been, you've stripped away everything except the wanting. He walked toward the cauldron, which the old magic told him was a foot short of its full charge, which meant the ritual wasn't complete. You want to be whole again. You want a body. You want to have what you've been running from for 50 years, life, actual life, not this. He gestured at the wrapped thing. I could destroy what's left of you right now. You know that. You won't, said the thin voice, and there was a quality in it now, not the contempt Harry had expected but something sharper. Calculation. Not because I'm afraid of you, Harry said. He crouched in front of the small, robed thing on the ground and looked at it directly. Because destroying you now doesn't fix anything. You're an effect, Tom. The cause is still out there. The world that made you, the one where a half-blood orphan grows up and discovers that the wizarding world has divided everything into worth and worthlessness, pure and impure, and that someone who crosses the line from one side to the other can either accept the hierarchy or tear it down, that world is still running. Destroying you tonight and leaving that world intact just makes the next you in 20 years. The graveyard was very quiet. I'm going to change the framework, Harry said. I'm going to put back what was taken, restore what was corrupted. And the world I'm building, Tom Riddle would never have needed to become Voldemort in it. Because the thing you're most afraid of isn't death. He held the awakening stone, which was warm and almost luminous in the dark. It's insignificance. Dying as a half-blood orphan who wasn't special. Dying as someone who didn't matter. A long silence. You think, said Voldemort's thin voice, very slowly, that you can appeal to what I was before. I think what you were before is still technically in there, Harry said. Under everything. Merlin's journals talk about soul magic, about what actually happens to a soul that divides itself. It doesn't disappear. It contracts. It gets very small and very frightened and it keeps the original going by proximity rather than presence. He paused. There's a version of this where you don't have to be a Horcrux machine held together by terror. I'm not saying I trust you. I'm not saying there aren't consequences for what you've done. There are enormous consequences and they will be paid. He stood up. But I'm not going to stand in a graveyard and have the exact fight you planned for, on your terms, on your timeline. Not when I have another option. He looked at Wormtail. Where are the Horcruxes? Not a question. Not a torture-induced demand. Just a direct sentence, spoken in the tone that had been developing in him all year, the one that came from the same place as the ward on the door to Merlin's vault, the place where authority wasn't performed because it didn't have to be. Wormtail looked at him with the terrified eyes of a small animal that had spent its whole life choosing the most powerful nearby option to hide behind. Harry could see him calculating, Voldemort, weakened and incomplete, or this boy in a graveyard who had just walked into a resurrection ritual without flinching. There's a diary, Wormtail said. Already destroyed. A ring, Little Hangleton, the Gaunt House, in the foundations. A locket, Grimmauld Place, Black Family Vault. A cup, Bellatrix Lestrange's Vault, Gringotts. A diadem, Hogwarts, the Room of Hidden Things. He stopped. And the snake, Harry said. And the snake, Wormtail confirmed miserably. Harry put a hand to his forehead. Not to the scar. Just a general gesture of a person who has confirmed something they've been hoping wasn't true. And me, he said. The night the curse rebounded. The piece that didn't have anywhere to go. Cedric, still positioned at Harry's back, said quietly, Harry. It's all right, Harry said. He turned the awakening stone over in his hand once. It's been in there since I was 15 months old and it's been getting quieter all year. The awakening pushed it out to the edges. The stone pushed it further. He felt for it, the foreign thing, the piece that wasn't his, that had always been there like a splinter he'd grown accustomed to. It was there. Smaller than it had been. Retreating before the bloodline magic the way shadows retreat before light. He pressed the awakening stone to his forehead. Wormtail made a sound. The foreign piece resisted, he felt it, the Voldemort fragment in him that was not him, that had never been him, that had been a parasite for his entire conscious life. It pushed back. It knew what was happening. It used his own voice, inside his head, in the deep place where private thoughts lived, and it said stop 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 in a thin, high voice that was not Harry's. No, Harry said, and it was the same no he'd used on Wormtail's wand arm, from the same place, and the foreign piece, the terrified contracted thing, the 40-year-old soul fragment that had been hiding in a scar in a child's forehead, came loose. It hurt. He wasn't going to pretend it didn't hurt. But pain had context, and this pain had the context of a splinter being removed rather than something breaking, the specific quality of separation rather than damage, and it was over in seconds. The piece went to Voldemort. Back to what remained of its origin, pulled by the same magnetic truth that governed all of the Dark Lord's scattered soul, they belonged together, they'd always been pulling toward each other, and now the largest remaining fragment and its involuntary host were no longer sharing space. The wrapped thing on the ground moved. Something like a breath came from it that had not been possible before. Harry straightened up. The scar on his forehead was completely, totally, for the first time in 13 years, silent. He pressed 2 fingers to it. Nothing. No warmth, no prickle, no connection. Just skin. Right, he said. To Cedric, he said, take Wormtail. Incarcerous, around the wrists and ankles. We'll bring him back. Cedric had been standing very still for the last several minutes with the expression of someone watching history happen and understanding that they were watching history happen. He moved without argument, binding Wormtail efficiently while Harry turned back to the thing on the ground. The Horcruxes will be destroyed, Harry said to it. All of them. Gringotts will handle the ones in their vaults. Dumbledore can deal with the ring, carefully, because it has a curse that'll kill him if he's not careful. Tell him not to put it on. The diadem I'll do myself. Nagini, you would let me keep the snake, Voldemort said. Not quite a question. No, Harry said. I would let you say goodbye to the snake. There's a difference. Something shifted in the graveyard. Nothing visible. Just a quality in the air, a subtle change in the magical resonance, like a dial being turned by a fraction. Harry didn't know if what he'd offered was enough to reach whatever remained of Tom Riddle past 40 years of Voldemort. He didn't know if there was anything left to reach. But the old magic was built on the foundational principle that every magical being had inherent standing, that nobody was past the reach of the framework, no matter what they'd done to step outside it. He extended his hand toward the thing on the ground, palm up. Not in peace exactly. In acknowledgement. You exist. You are here. The framework sees you. The graveyard was very still. Then, from the wrapped thing, something that was not the thin high voice, something quieter, something that might have been the voice of a 12-year-old boy in an orphanage who'd found out he was magic and thought, for one specific second, that it meant he was going to be all right. Why? Because Merlin built this for exactly this situation, Harry said. Because the framework doesn't have exceptions. Because I don't get to decide who it applies to and who it doesn't, only whether I uphold it or I don't. He let his hand drop. And because you're not going to accept it tonight anyway, and this whole conversation is going to have to keep happening over a long time before it looks like anything useful, and I know that, and I'm still making the offer. Nothing from the ground. Then, you're a child. I'll be 14 in 3 weeks, Harry said, with the profound tiredness of someone who has heard this observation become less accurate over time. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the Triwizard Cup, which he'd been holding since the portkey arrived. He'd modified it in the 30 seconds of transit, layering a return enchantment over the existing one using the old magic, not replacing the portkey function but adding a controlled return function that could be activated intentionally. He pressed his thumb to the base and modified it the rest of the way. "Cedric," he said. "Ready?" Cedric, with Wormtail's bound hands in his grip, walked up beside him. He looked at Harry with the steady, wide-open expression he'd been wearing for the last 20 minutes, the one that meant he was taking in more than he was saying. "What happens to?" He looked at the ground. "He can't do the ritual without his servants," Harry said. "Without Wormtail, without Nagini to deliver the venom, without me. The cauldron's a foot short. He stays as he is for now." He looked at the thing on the ground one last time. "Which you know. Which is why you're not trying to stop us." "I am thinking," Voldemort said, in the tone of someone setting something down temporarily rather than permanently, "about what you said." Harry touched the cup. The portkey activated with a sound like a door closing on a very long chapter, and the graveyard and the cauldron and the darkness went away, and the warm summer evening of Hogwarts came back in a rush of light and noise, the crowd around the tournament maze erupting as the champions materialized at the entrance, Harry and Cedric and a bound and terrified Peter Pettigrew. And Harry landed on both feet in the grass and stood in the sudden blaze of lights and faces and confusion, and he thought. That's one. The Horcruxes were next. Then the Ministry. Then the rest. The aftermath was controlled chaos, which was the best kind. Dumbledore reached him first, moving through the crowd with a speed that contradicted his age and an expression that contradicted his usual composure, something raw in it, something that had been suppressed for 13 years and was now very close to the surface. "Harry," he said. "Wormtail," Harry said, and stepped back so Dumbledore could see Pettigrew, bound and trembling in Cedric's grip. "He'll need Veritaserum and secure holding, not Azkaban, because Azkaban has leaks and he'll talk to Voldemort's people before morning if you put him there." He paused. "I know where the Horcruxes are." Dumbledore stared at him. Not the careful, managed stare. The actual one, behind the management. "How?" "He told me," Harry said simply. "The full list. I'll write it down for you tonight, locations, condition, what's needed to destroy each one. The ring has a killing curse layered into it, so don't touch it directly. I'll include the containment approach from Merlin's journals." He looked at Pettigrew, who was staring at Harry with the expression of a man who had offered up 11 years of his life in service to Voldemort and was now being handed over to Dumbledore by a 13-year-old like a mildly inconvenient errand. "He talks to you willingly because he's afraid of being returned to Voldemort. Use that." Dumbledore said nothing for a moment. The crowd was still surging around them, Fleur appearing with her mother, the Diggory's nearby, Amos Diggory's face when he saw Cedric alive and whole and unharmed cycling through relief and confusion as he processed Wormtail and restraints, and Harry standing in the center of it all with the particular quality of someone who had been to a crisis and come back from it with the crisis under their arm. "Voldemort," Dumbledore said. "In the graveyard." "Still there," Harry said. "Still incomplete. The ritual didn't happen. He'll find another way, another timeline, but not tonight." He met Dumbledore's eyes. "I left him the choice. I know you think that's naive. I think," Dumbledore said carefully, "that it is either the most naive thing anyone has done in the last 50 years, or the most sophisticated." "Probably both," Harry said. "For now, we have Pettigrew. We have the Horcrux locations. We have the evidence to bring to the Wisengamot and the press." He thought of Malfoy, somewhere in the crowd. He'd seen silver blonde hair near the Ministry officials section on the way in. He thought of Fudge, who would be moving to contain this in exactly the wrong way if someone didn't intercept the narrative. "Where's the minister?" Dumbledore blinked. "I believe find him before he talks to Malfoy," Harry said. "I need to speak with him tonight, with you present, before his version of events has a chance to calcify." He looked around the crowd and found Hermione's face. She was 40 feet away, held back by the press of people, her face taut and pale with the specific anxiety of someone who has known something terrible might happen and has spent 4 hours not knowing if it has. He met her eyes. He shook his head once, slowly, "I'm fine, everything's fine," and he watched the tension go out of her shoulders like a string cut. Ron was beside her, an arm around her, looking at Harry with an expression that was trying to be relief and kept turning into something wetter at the edges. Harry nodded at both of them and turned back to Dumbledore. "The minister." Dumbledore moved. For the first time in Harry's memory, Albus Dumbledore moved because Harry told him to, and the specific quality of that movement, purposeful, immediate, without the usual beat of consideration, told Harry something important. Something had shifted tonight. Not just Voldemort's incomplete ritual, not just Wormtail and restraints, not just the Horcrux list. Something in the architecture of the next several years had realigned, and Dumbledore felt it and was recalibrating, and the recalibration had produced, for the first time, deference. Harry didn't feel triumphant about it. He felt the weight of it, the responsibility in it, the way every version of real authority he'd encountered in Merlin's journals had described authority feeling, not like winning but like the starting gun. Cedric appeared at his elbow, having handed Wormtail to a pair of Aurors who'd materialized from somewhere. He looked at Harry and said, very quietly, "You knew the whole time." "Most of it," Harry said. "In the maze. You said 30 seconds might feel like longer." "It was longer," Harry acknowledged. "It was 20 minutes, Cedric said. 23, Harry said. "I miscalculated the portkey modification." Cedric let out a breath that was half laugh and half something else. "You modified a portkey to a dark ritual site in midair." "Not midair," Harry said. "In transit. There's a difference." "Right," Cedric said. "Obviously." He looked at the crowd, at the blazing lights of the Hogwarts grounds, at the tournament that had just ended in the most catastrophically irregular way since its original inception. "What now?" "Now," Harry said, "we talk to the minister, we brief Dumbledore on the Horcrux locations, and then tomorrow morning we file the Wisengamot documents that Ragnox had ready since May." He looked at Cedric. "Then the real work starts." "And Voldemort?" Harry thought about the graveyard. The thin voice, the contracted thing, the moment when it had said why in a register that was almost but not quite Tom Riddle. He thought about the awakening stone's warmth against his forehead, the soul fragment releasing, the silence in his scar. "Voldemort is going to be a long conversation," he said. "One I fully intend to have. But he can't make himself a body without servants, and his servants are about to have a very bad year." He picked up the Triwizard Cup, which was just an object now, inert, the portkey enchantments exhausted. It caught the floodlights and threw gold across his face. "I told him the framework doesn't have exceptions. I meant it. But no exceptions works both ways. It means he gets offered the chance to exist within it, and it means if he refuses, the framework's response is absolute." "What does absolute look like?" Cedric asked. Harry considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Like everything Merlin built coming down on a single point," he said. "Like the full weight of 1,000 years of magical law applied without mitigation." He set the cup down on the grass. "Like something that makes the Elder Wand look like a letter opener." Cedric looked at him for a long time. "You're 14 in 3 weeks, he said, with an inflection that was not quite what the sentence was usually meant to convey. "I know," Harry said. "It's been a busy year." Minister Cornelius Fudge was exactly as advertised, a man whose primary skill was political survival and whose reaction to extraordinary events was to calculate their threat to his position before responding to them on their actual merits. He was standing near the judge's table when Dumbledore brought Harry to him, his bowler hat askew, his face cycling through the particular sequence of emotions that meant he'd already heard several conflicting things and was attempting to determine which version required the least personal accountability. "Potter," Fudge said. Then, with a visible recalibration as he took in Harry's expression and posture, "Mr. Potter." "Minister," Harry said. "I need 5 minutes of your time and then you can go back to managing whatever version of tonight's events you prefer." But the 5 minutes happened first. Fudge opened his mouth. Dumbledore, standing slightly behind Harry, said nothing. This itself seemed to communicate something to Fudge, whose eyes moved between them and settled on Harry with the specific uncertainty of a man who had expected the headmaster to be running this meeting. "All right," Fudge said. Harry laid it out. Wormtail's identity and the evidence of Peter Pettigrew's survival, Sirius Black's innocence, which followed directly and immediately and was not negotiable as a consequence. The Horcrux locations, which he did not give in full but indicated existed, which was enough for the minister's purpose tonight. The evidence of Ministry employee Bartemius Crouch Jr. operating within Hogwarts under an assumed identity on behalf of Voldemort. The attempt on Harry's life via the Triwizard Cup, which constituted a direct breach of the Ministry's duty to protect a minor in their care. And finally, the Ambrosius claim, which the Ministry had been sitting on since August without formal response. "I'll need a formal Ministry response to the Ambrosius filing by the end of the month," Harry said. "The documentation is complete. The legal basis is incontestable. Gringotts has the original compacts. The Wisingamot seat will be activated whether the Ministry formally acknowledges it or not. The seat activates on the living heir's declaration, not the Ministry's approval, but I prefer to do this with institutional cooperation rather than without it." Fudge stared at him. "I'm also requesting," Harry said, "that the formal inquiry into tonight's events include an investigation of the known Death Eaters who have been operating within Ministry structures. I have a list." He reached into his pocket and produced a piece of parchment, Hermione's handwriting, organized by department, compiled over the last 3 months from cross-referencing Merlin's historical legal records against current Ministry employee records, which told you a great deal about which old families had placed which members in which positions of access. He set it on the table between them. "That's a good place to start." Fudge looked at the list. He looked at Harry. He looked at Dumbledore, who was wearing the expression he wore when he was extremely impressed and was choosing not to say so. "You're 14, Fudge said. "Almost," Harry said. 3 weeks. Fudge picked up the list. They were done by midnight. Wormtail in secure Ministry holding. Fudge with his list and his instructions and the barely contained expression of a politician who had just discovered that his department was significantly more compromised than he'd allowed himself to know. Dumbledore with the Horcrux locations, which Harry had spent an hour writing up in careful detail, including the containment protocols from Merlin's journals and a very specific warning about the ring and the resurrection stone set into it. "Do not put it on, under any circumstances, I mean it." There are 3 paragraphs in Journal 14 about why and none of them are encouraging. He'd watched Dumbledore read that last line and something in the old man's face go very still. "Thank you," Dumbledore had said, quietly. Harry had nodded. He'd meant it. By the time he got back to the Gryffindor dormitory it was past 1 in the morning and Ron and Hermione were sitting on the floor of the common room in front of the fire, clearly having given up on the pretense that they were going to sleep. Hermione had 3 books, which she closed immediately when Harry came through the portrait hole. Ron had a plate of sandwiches from somewhere, because Ron's response to crisis was logistics. Harry sat on the floor between them and took a sandwich. Nobody said anything for a moment. "The scar," Hermione said finally. Harry pressed 2 fingers to his forehead. Still silent. "The Horcrux piece came out," he said. "In the graveyard. The awakening stone helped." Hermione looked at the scar for a long time with the expression she wore when something enormous was happening and she was giving herself 30 seconds to feel it before cataloging it. She reached out and touched his forehead, very briefly, her fingertips light. Then she pulled her hand back. "Okay," she said. Okay, Harry said. Did you? Ron started. Voldemort's still out there, Harry said. Incomplete. Without a body. The ritual didn't happen. Wormtail's in Ministry custody, which cuts off his primary servant access. Nagini's in the graveyard with him, and that's a problem we'll deal with separately. He took another bite of sandwich. It went about how I expected, which I know sounds alarming. It sounds mental, Ron said, with a warmth in it that made it a term of affection rather than criticism. You went to a dark ritual site for fun. Not for fun, Harry said. For information. And because it needed to happen on my terms, not Voldemort's. The graveyard was his plan. Letting it happen on my schedule rather than his changed the whole equation. He'll be furious, Hermione said. Probably, Harry said. Or he'll think. I told him some things that I meant. About the framework. About what I'm building. He looked at the fire. He didn't dismiss it. He said he was thinking about it. A silence. You think he might? Ron started carefully. No, Harry said. Not now. Not soon. Maybe not ever. But the offer has to be on the table because the framework demands it. He finished the sandwich. Also, I genuinely believe the wizarding world that made Tom Riddle is the bigger long-term problem, and fixing it is the real work. Ron looked at Hermione. Hermione looked at Ron. Some kind of communication passed between them that Harry had never learned to intercept. Right, Ron said, turning back to Harry with a decision in his face. Then that's what we do. We have the Wisingamot filing in the morning, Hermione said, pulling one of her books back open. The response deadline Fudge agreed to. The serious situation, we'll need to get that moving immediately. His wrongful imprisonment case is now straightforward with Pettigrew in custody. She was writing as she talked, the list growing, her handwriting getting smaller and faster the way it did when the situation was serious. And Gringotts, Ragnarok will need to know about the vault Horcruxes, because that's technically a security matter for the bank as much as anything else. Ragnarok is going to be extremely unhappy that there's a Horcrux in Gringotts, Harry said. He's going to be furious, Hermione agreed, with a slight smile. He's also going to be a very useful ally because of it. Harry leaned his head back against the sofa behind him and looked up at the common room ceiling, the warm familiar scarlet and gold of the room he'd been coming back to for 4 years, the fire crackling, the castle settling into its nighttime quiet around them. He thought about the graveyard and the silence in his scar. He thought about Wormtail's face when the old magic said no. He thought about the thin voice asking why in a register that was almost Tom Riddle. He thought about Merlin's last journal entry, which he'd read so many times now he could recite it, I have done what I can do. The rest belongs to the one who comes after. I hope they understand that the work was never about power. Power is the scaffold. The work is what you build on it. He understood. Get some sleep, he said to both of them. Tomorrow's a long day. Hermione closed the book with the expression of someone who was absolutely not going to sleep for at least 2 more hours. Ron was already reaching for another sandwich. Harry closed his eyes and felt the silence where the scar used to speak, and the awakening stone warm in his pocket, and the vast patient thing in his chest breathing steadily in the dark. One chapter closed. The next one was already writing itself. Chapter 5. The Parliament of Magic. The Wisingamot chamber hadn't changed in 200 years. Harry could tell, standing in the public gallery above it on a Thursday morning in September, because Merlin's journals described it with a specificity that still matched, the tiered stone seating arranged in a horseshoe, the high ceiling with its enchanted sky, the central floor where the accused stood and the interrogators positioned themselves with the practiced authority of people who had been doing this long enough that the performance of justice had become indistinguishable from the thing itself. He'd been in this room once before, in a memory, Dumbledore's pensieve, the trial of Bartemius Crouch Jr., the Lestranges. He'd stood in Dumbledore's memory and watched the chamber operate and had felt, even then, that something was structurally wrong with it. The way the seats were arranged communicated who had standing before anyone spoke. The way the accused stood on the floor while the Wiesengemot sat elevated told you everything about how justice was expected to flow. Today was Sirius's hearing. 3 months after the graveyard. Wormtail had given his testimony under Veritaserum in August, and the ministry had spent those 3 months visibly struggling with what to do with the information. Fudge had sat on the list Harry had given him with the specific reluctance of a man who knows a document will rearrange his world if he acts on it and has decided that not acting is a form of action. The Ambrosius filing had received a response, technically within deadline, legally thorough, and comprehensively evasive, that had required Ragnarok to spend a productive afternoon identifying which parts were stalling and which parts were substantive. The answer was mostly stalling. But Sirius's case was too clean to stall. Wormtail alive, confessed, in custody, on record under Veritaserum. The faked death. The staged crime scene. 12 years of wrongful imprisonment. Fudge could delay the structural reforms, could ignore the list, could treat the Ambrosius claim as an administrative anomaly requiring indefinite verification, but he could not look at Peter Pettigrew's Veritaserum testimony and keep Sirius Black in Azkaban without committing a crime sufficiently clear that even the Daily Prophet couldn't be managed around it. Harry had made sure of that by giving Rita Skeeter an exclusive in July. He hadn't enjoyed it. Rita Skeeter was a person of limited ethical range and a gift for turning truth into something that served her before it served anyone else. But she also had 3 million readers, and sometimes the right information in the wrong hands still got where it needed to go. He'd sat across from her at a table in the leaky cauldron, had told her exactly what to print and nothing else, and had watched her quick quotes cool move with a ferocity that suggested she understood she was being handed something significant and was choosing, for once, to simply carry it rather than reinterpret it. The headline had been, Wormtail Lives, The Truth About Sirius Black, Peter Pettigrew, and 12 years of ministry incompetence. Fudge had called Harry's response to that headline unprintable. Harry had found that encouraging. So the hearing happened. Harry watched from the gallery with Hermione on one side and Ragnarok on the other, because Ragnarok had chosen to attend in a personal capacity and nobody had thought to tell him he couldn't. The goblin sat in the gallery with the flat, watchful quality of someone making a formal record, and several members of the Wiesengemot kept glancing up at him with the barely concealed anxiety of people who knew that Gringotts observing their proceedings was not a neutral act. Sirius was brought in. Harry had met him properly in August, in a safe house that Dumbledore had arranged after the graveyard, a cottage in Wales that smelled of damp and old books, where Sirius had opened the door and looked at Harry and said absolutely nothing for several seconds because he was clearly working through something too large for immediate speech. He was thinner than his Azkaban photos, which had been taken at the worst point, grey-faced and hollow, but the thinness was already filling back out, and his eyes had the quality Harry had been told about but was seeing for the first time, the sharpness in them, his father's friend, the person who had survived 12 years of Dementors by holding on to a truth and refusing to let it become a belief because beliefs could be doubted and truth couldn't. They'd talked for 3 hours that first day. About James and Lily, about the war, about what Harry was doing and what it meant. Sirius listened to all of it with the concentrated attention of someone making up for 12 years of not being able to receive information, processing it in layers, asking occasional sharp questions that cut directly to the mechanisms underneath the events. At the end, he'd said, "Your father would have been," and stopped. Started again. "There's not a word for it," he said. "There isn't a word big enough." Harry had felt the thing in his chest move, warm and sure, and had said simply, "I know." Now Sirius stood on the chamber floor in robes that were new but still slightly too big, and he looked up at the Wiesengemot with the expression of someone who had been wronged for so long that being right felt almost theoretical. The hearing took 4 hours. Wormtail's testimony was read into the record. 3 aurors who had worked the original Pettigrew case testified. The forensic magic evidence was presented, the wand analysis, the rat finger that had been in Scabbers for 12 years, the specific magical signature of the faked explosion. Harry sat in the gallery and did not intervene. This was not his to carry across the finish line. He'd done his part, the Veritaserum, the testimony, the newspaper, and the rest belonged to the process. When Fudge read the verdict, cleared of all charges, record expunged, reparations to be determined, Sirius stood very still for a moment, then looked up at the gallery, found Harry's face, and smiled. Not the wild grin from the newspaper photographs. Something quieter. Something that had come through something. Harry smiled back. Ragnarok, beside him, said nothing, but made a precise note on the parchment he'd been keeping. The Wisengamot session the following week was a different matter entirely. Harry arrived in the chamber not in the public gallery but on the floor, which was where he was entitled to be and where nobody had ever imagined he'd actually show up. He wore no school robes. He wore the clothes that had been in the wardrobe in Gringotts' adjoining chamber, plain, well-made, dark, the ambrosious sigil on the left breast in a form so understated that you had to know what you were looking for. He carried his wand in his wrist holster and the awakening stone in his pocket and nothing else, because he'd learned this year that the things you needed most were usually the ones you could carry without effort. The chamber had been in informal pre-session discussion when he walked in, the members of the Wisengamot talking in clusters, adjusting robes, reviewing documents. The conversation stopped in sections as he moved across the floor toward the Ambrosius seat, a seat that had been empty for 9 centuries, in the front row of the left arc, identified in the chamber records and by the sigil carved subtly into its armrest, which Harry had confirmed with Ragnarok the previous week. He sat down. The chamber was completely quiet within approximately 10 seconds. Lucius Malfoy, 3 seats to the right and 1 row back, was looking at him with an expression that Harry had learned to read as controlled recalculation, Malfoy at his most genuinely dangerous, when he was abandoning a plan mid-execution and building a new one. Fudge, in the Chief Warlock's chair at the head of the horseshoe, Dumbledore having declined the position after the events of 4th year, citing a conflict of interest with Hogwarts obligations that everyone understood was actually a careful political repositioning. Fudge was looking at Harry with the expression of a man who has been told something was coming and believed he'd prepared for it and is now discovering that preparation and readiness are not the same thing. Dumbledore was in the chamber too, in the advisory section to the left of the Chief Warlock's chair, which was his current role, present, influential, without the specific authority of a vote or a seat. He looked at Harry with those endlessly complicated blue eyes and gave a small nod. Harry nodded back. The session, Fudge said, clearing his throat, is called to order. The agenda, before the agenda, Harry said. His voice carried easily. He hadn't raised it. The chamber's acoustics were built to carry, and the old magic carried further than acoustics anyway, it moved through the air with a natural authority that had nothing to do with volume. Fudge stopped. I'd like to formally invoke the Ambrosius right of address, Harry said. Which is documented in the original compact and which supersedes the standard session agenda when invoked by the living heir. He reached into his jacket and produced a document, one of several Ragnarok had prepared, crisp official parchment with the Gringotts seal, and set it on the table before the Chief Warlock's position. That's the formal invocation. The compact's text is appended. Fudge picked it up. Read it. His face went through several colors. A senior Wisengamot member 3 rows back, Madame Longbottom, Neville's grandmother, a woman with the bearing of someone who had survived 3 Dark Lords through a combination of steel and stubbornness, said, the right of address is legitimate. I've reviewed the documentation. The compact is authentic. She looked at Harry with sharp eyes that reminded him of Neville and simultaneously of the fact that Neville came from somewhere formidable. Proceed, Mr. Potter Ambrosius. A murmur moved through the chamber like a wave. Several people Harry recognized, Malfoy allies, ministry officials who had been on Hermione's list, shifted in their seats with the specific quality of people revising their expectations of how this morning was going to go. Harry stood up. I'm going to talk about 3 things, he said, moving to the center of the floor. Not because the position was required but because it was natural, the center of the chamber, the point where the horseshoe's attention naturally collected. The first is the current status of Voldemort's attempted return and what we know about it. The second is the structural changes to Wisengamot procedure and ministry oversight that the Ambrosius compacts require. The third is the list. Silence. The list, Malfoy said, from his seat. His voice was level and pleasant, which was how he was most dangerous. What list would that be? The one I gave the minister in June, Harry said, looking at Malfoy directly. The one documenting ministry employees and Wizengamot members with confirmed ties to Voldemort's organization. I understand it's been under review for 3 months. He looked at Fudge. I'd like an update on that review. Fudge's hands were very still on the arms of his chair. That documentation is undergoing. It's been 3 months, Harry said. Voldemort is currently in a weakened state because we disrupted his resurrection ritual in June. That window is not indefinite. Every week we spend reviewing documentation is a week his remaining servants spend finding another path back. I'd like to know which names on the list have been investigated and what the findings are. That information is classified, said a man 3 rows up, Thaddeus Knott, whose name was on the list. To the Ambrosius heir? Harry said. No. That's in the compact too. Page 9, I believe. He looked at the room. I'm not asking anyone here to confess. I'm asking the ministry to do its job, and I'm invoking the legal right to ask that question in this chamber, and I'm doing it on the record. He paused. I'd also note, for the record, that the right of address includes the right of compelled response from ministry representatives. Which means Fudge answers me. The chamber's quality of silence changed. Several people looked at Fudge. Several looked at Malfoy. Several looked at Dumbledore, who was watching Harry with an expression that was doing at least 5 things at once. Fudge looked at the document in his hand. He looked at Harry. He made a calculation. Harry could see it happening, the rapid assessment of options, the realization that the compact was genuine and the legal mechanism was real and the public record would show whether he complied or not. 7 names have been formally investigated, he said. 3 have been cleared. 4 are ongoing. How many names are on the list? Harry asked. A pause. 31. So 24 names haven't been investigated at all, Harry said. Not an accusation. A statement of fact, offered flatly, with the precision of someone who knew the number before he'd asked and was confirming it on the record. I'd like a timeline for the remaining investigations. Mr. Potter Ambrosius, said Thaddeus Knott, leaning forward, you are a 15-year-old student at Hogwarts. The suggestion that you should be directing ministry investigative timelines is, the suggestion, Harry said, looking at Knott with the particular quality of attention he gave people who were not quite threatening and not quite innocent, is made by the Ambrosius heir invoking a 900-year-old legal compact. My age is not relevant to the compact's authority. He let that land. But since you've raised it, I'll point out that my age also means I've been fighting Voldemort's organization since I was 11, which is 3 years longer than most people in this room have been willing to acknowledge it exists. I think I've earned the right to ask about a timeline. Knott sat back. His face was careful and still. Madame Longbottom made a sound that might have been approval. The structural changes, Harry continued, moving on without giving the chamber time to reorganize around the Knott moment. The Ambrosius compacts require 3 specific reforms to how this chamber operates. He'd gone over these with Ragnarok until he could recite them in his sleep. The first is independent oversight of Wizengamot decisions, a panel appointed by Gringotts, not the ministry, since Gringotts is the compact's designated neutral party. The second is mandatory conflict of interest declaration before votes on matters where a member has a personal financial stake. The third is a formal creature representative seat. Originally there were 3, 1 for goblins, 1 for centaurs, and 1 for house elves, all of which were removed by the Wizengamot in 1463 without the compact's authority to do so. Those seats are being reinstated. The chamber erupted. Not loudly, Wizengamot members were generally too composed for shouting, but in a controlled, tightly articulated way of people who were very angry and very practiced at expressing anger within the forms of procedure. Several people spoke at once. Fudge called for order. Malfoy's expression had moved past controlled recalculation into something grimmer and more genuine. Harry stood in the center of the floor and waited. When the noise subsided enough, "The compact doesn't require your approval to reinstate the creature seats," he said. "Those seats were removed in violation of the original agreement. Their reinstatement is a correction, not a proposal. I'm informing this chamber, not requesting permission." "That's an extraordinary claim," said a Wisengamot member Harry didn't recognize, somewhere in the middle rows. "The documentation at Gringotts is extraordinary," Harry agreed. "I'd encourage any member who has doubts about its authenticity to visit Ragnarok personally. He's been waiting 900 years to show someone." A small stir at the mention of Ragnarok. Several people looked at the gallery. Ragnarok, who was still sitting in the gallery making notes, did not look up. Dumbledore raised a hand. The chamber looked at him. "I'd like to suggest," he said, in the tone he used when he was being very careful, "that the chamber take a formal recess to review the compact documentation before proceeding." Harry looked at Dumbledore. Dumbledore looked at Harry. The communication between them was a full paragraph long and went entirely without words. 30 minutes, Harry said. "I'll answer questions individually during the recess. After that, I'd like to continue." He moved back to the Ambrosia's seat and sat down, and the chamber broke apart around him into a dozen urgent private conversations. Madame Longbottom was at his side within 90 seconds, moving with the efficiency of someone who didn't waste time on approach. She sat in the seat beside him, which was technically not her assigned position, with the authority of someone who had been sitting wherever she chose for 60 years. "The creature seats," she said. "Yes," Harry said. "The goblin's seat, Ragnarok himself?" "He hasn't said. Gringotts would designate a representative through their own process." "And house elves?" Her expression was complicated. "They've been bound for centuries." "They may not. The compact's language on the house elf seat is specific," Harry said. "It doesn't require a representative who advocates for the current situation. It requires a representative who can speak to the interests of house elves as they actually are, not as the wizarding world prefers to imagine them." He thought of Dobby, brilliant, uncontainable Dobby, who had been trying to help him since second year with the specific energy of someone operating at capacity in a situation that hadn't been designed for them to succeed. "I have someone in mind. For the long term. There are steps before that." Madame Longbottom looked at him for a moment, and something shifted in her face, a recalibration similar to Dumbledore's but with a different quality, less about power dynamics and more about a woman who had spent decades fighting for things in a system that kept reabsorbing her efforts, discovering that the system was about to change shape. "Neville speaks highly of you," she said. "Neville's one of the best people I know," Harry said. "You raised someone exceptional." She was quiet for a moment. "Then, my grandson told me about the maze," she said. "About the second task. About the work you've been doing." She straightened her already straight spine. "I have sat in this chamber for 40 years, Mr. Potter Ambrosius. I have watched it fail, and fail, and fail, in every way you've identified and several you haven't yet. I have made my peace with the pace of change in the way that people make their peace with things they cannot accelerate." She looked at the chamber around them, at the conversations happening, at Malfoy talking quietly to two allies in the far arc with controlled urgency. "I have not made my peace with the failure itself." "Then vote with me," Harry said simply. She looked at him. "On the structural reforms." "On all of it. When the votes come. And they will come, because Fudge will try to put the compact reforms through a standard vote even though the compact doesn't require one, because the vote is how he retains the illusion of procedure." He met her eyes. "I need Wisengamot members who understand what this is and are willing to stand for it. Not because they owe me anything. Because the framework is right." A long pause. "I'll review the documentation," she said, which Harry understood to mean yes. The recess ran 40 minutes rather than 30. Harry spent it talking to 9 different people, 3 of whom were already sympathetic, 3 of whom were cautiously curious, and 3 of whom were clearly probing for weaknesses in the compact's legal foundation. He answered the last group with the thorough patience of someone who had read the documentation 17 times and knew exactly where the solid ground was. Malfoy didn't approach him during the recess. That was more interesting than if he had. It meant Malfoy was waiting for a better moment, which meant Malfoy wasn't done and had something prepared that he wanted to deploy at a specific point. Harry kept that in mind. When the session reconvened, Harry addressed Voldemort. He laid out what he knew, the Horcrux list, the current status of the destruction effort, the timeline of the attempted resurrection and why it had failed. He named names carefully: Pettigrew, Crouch Jr., the confirmed Death Eaters who were already in custody, and he named the ones who weren't, and he watched which members of the Wizengamot looked at their hands when those names were read. He kept a mental note. Then Malfoy stood. He did it with impeccable timing, waited for Harry to finish the Voldemort briefing, let the chamber settle, let the weight of the information create a gravity that he could then use as context for his objection. "The Ambrosius heir has given the chamber a great deal to consider," Malfoy said. "The documentation is, as acknowledged, substantial. The legal basis for the compact appears to be genuine." He paused. "My concern is not the compact itself. My concern is the question of competence." Harry waited. "The heir is 15 years old," Malfoy said. "The compact was written for a fully adult, fully trained magical practitioner of the Ambrosius line. Its powers, including the right of address, including the right to compel ministry response, including the ability to reinstate historical chamber positions, are extraordinary. Exercising them requires, I would argue, a maturity of judgment that the heir, despite his evident gifts, has not yet fully developed." He looked at Harry with an expression of measured reasonableness that was one of the more sophisticated weapons Harry had seen deployed. "I propose a review period. 2 years. During which the heir's development can be assessed and the compact's full authority activated upon completion of his formal magical education." The chamber considered this. Harry could feel the way it landed, the reasonable tone, the apparently benign suggestion, the legal cover it provided for simply waiting until the political landscape could be rearranged around the delay. 2 years was enough to gut the reforms before they took hold. "That's a creative interpretation," Harry said pleasantly. Malfoy looked at him. "The compact doesn't contain a competence clause," Harry said. "I've read every word of it, in the original Old Merlinic script, which I can read directly. The authority transfers on the heir's survival of death and formal declaration. Which has happened. Both of those events were documented and time-stamped." He looked around the chamber. "But I'll address the underlying point, since it deserves a response. I'm 15. Yes. And I've spent the last 2 years working through Merlin's complete personal library, the original magical legal framework of Britain, 900 years of sealed Gringotts documentation, and a full account of how Voldemort's organization has operated and why it's been successful. I'll match my knowledge of this chamber's history and the compact's legal foundation against anyone in this room." He let that sit for a second. "If someone wants to challenge it, I'm open to that. Ask me anything." Nobody did. "The review period," Malfoy said, "would also allow time to, Mr. Malfoy," Harry said. He wasn't rude. He wasn't aggressive. He was simply direct, in the way that bypassed all the layers of procedure that directness usually had to fight through. "Your name is on the list. The one I gave the minister in June. I want you to know that I know that, and that it's documented at Gringotts, and that your presence on it is not why I'm declining the review period suggestion. I'm declining it because the compact doesn't support it. Your name on the list is a separate matter that will be handled separately." He looked at Malfoy with the same attention he'd given him in the Hogwarts library in 4th year. "I meant what I said then. If your power comes from genuine contribution, you have nothing to fear from the reforms. But if you're currently using a Wizengamot seat to protect people who tried to kill me when I was 15 months old, I'd suggest spending the review period thinking about which side of that line you want to be on." The chamber was very quiet. Lucius Malfoy looked at Harry for a long moment with an expression that was impossible to fully read. Then he sat down. The votes went forward. Not all of them passed, the ministry was what it was, and 3 reforms failed on the first round by margins that Harry noted carefully because the voting record was now public and the Daily Prophet had a reporter in the gallery. But the independent oversight panel passed. The conflict of interest declaration passed. The creature seats, which most members clearly hadn't expected to come to a formal vote, passed by 2 votes, with Madame Longbottom's clear voice among those in favor. When it was over, Harry sat in the Ambrosius seat and felt the thing in his chest do its steady work, integrating the morning into the running account of what had been built and what remained. He thought about Merlin's last journal, about ceilings and foundations. He thought about the vote margin on the creature seats, razor thin, fragile, the kind of margin that needed consolidating quickly before the losing side found procedural grounds to challenge it. He had 2 months before term started. Plenty of time. The summer moved fast, which Harry had come to expect from summers that mattered. He worked in the vault, he met with Ragnarok twice a week, he had 3 more Weisengamot sessions that were less dramatic than the first but more productive, each one laying another layer of the reformed framework into the existing structure, each one requiring less explanation than the last because the documentation was becoming familiar and the members who were going to be allies had settled into that role. Sirius moved into Grimmauld Place properly, which required first removing a Horcrux from it. The locket, Salazar Slytherin's locket, one of Voldemort's 7, had been in the Black family vault under a concealment charm that had been invisible to everyone except Harry, who felt its signature the way he'd felt Moody's polyjuice. He took it out with the particular care that Merlin's journals prescribed for Horcrux handling, contained it in a seal that prevented its influence from radiating outward, and brought it to Dumbledore, who destroyed it with a technique that Harry had provided and which Dumbledore executed with the focused precision of someone who had once made the error described in the caution note and was not going to repeat it. The ring was gone, destroyed in July, the resurrection stone separated from it and sent to Gringotts for secure storage, because the stone itself was an hallow and the hallows were not things to be casually destroyed, and Harry's relationship with the hallows was the subject of an entirely separate section of Merlin's journals that he was still working through. He found the diadem himself, in the room of requirement, in early August. It was there when he walked in, resting on a bust in the forest of hidden things as if it had always been decorative. He recognized it immediately, the eagle of Ravenclaw, the inscription around the brim. He felt the Horcrux signature underneath it like a second, darker pulse. He took it to the Chamber of Secrets, which he'd explored properly in second year and which was, it turned out, built on the same foundational layer as the vault. Salazar Slytherin had built it using techniques adjacent to Merlin's, and it responded to the bloodline accordingly. He destroyed the diadem in the chamber, using the Fiendfire technique controlled and contained by the old magic, and came back up through the pipe covered in basilisk-smelling dust and with 1 less Horcrux to worry about. 3 down. Nagini left. Which meant Voldemort. He told Dumbledore about Nagini and watched the old man think it through. The snake must be separated from him, Dumbledore said. She's both a Horcrux and his most effective weapon. I know, Harry said. I'm working on it. He paused. Has there been any movement? From Voldemort? Whispers, Dumbledore said. He is looking for another path. Another servant capable of the ritual. He looked at Harry. He has not found one yet. He won't, Harry said. Because the ritual requires my blood specifically, the Lily Evans sacrificial magic, the blood protection, and I've spent the summer reinforcing that protection with every technique in Merlin's journals. What Voldemort wants from me he can't take by force. He'd need me to give it willingly. And you won't. I won't, Harry agreed. And he knows it. Which is why I think, he stopped. Dumbledore waited. The conversation in the graveyard, Harry said slowly. The why at the end. I've been thinking about it since June. He asked why. Not rhetorically. He asked because something I said reached something. He looked at his hands. The gold under the skin was always visible to him now, at any time of day, the bloodline integrated past the point of being a feature he was aware of and into the territory of simply being him. I think he's thinking about it. You think Voldemort is reconsidering his choices, Dumbledore said, very carefully, in the tone of someone who was giving a remarkable amount of credit to a remarkable proposition. I think Tom Riddle is reconsidering his choices, Harry said. Voldemort is the name he gave himself. Tom Riddle is what's underneath. And Tom Riddle is scared, has always been scared, and the thing he's been most scared of is a world that sees him as the half-blood orphan. He met Dumbledore's eyes. I told him I'm changing that world. I think he believes me. Dumbledore was quiet for a long time. Outside the window of the office, it was late August, the grounds golden and dry before the first rains. A pair of thestrals moved through the late afternoon, visible to Harry now, visible to more people than Hogwarts liked to count. If you're right, Dumbledore said, it would be the most extraordinary thing this world has seen in a century. If I'm wrong, Harry said, he tries to find another path and I deal with it when it comes. He stood up. Either way, I've got the 5th year to work with. I'd like to talk about the defense against the dark arts situation before term starts. Dumbledore's expression shifted to something that was rueful and slightly embarrassed. The position is, there have been difficulties filling it. I know, Harry said. I'd like to propose an alternative. I'd like to teach it myself. A very long pause. Harry. Not officially. I'm not suggesting you list me on the faculty roster. I'm suggesting a student-run practical component, authorized by you, structured as a supplement to whoever you manage to hire. He looked at Dumbledore. I've been teaching people things all year. Cedric. Neville. The second task. Various conversations that weren't officially tutorials but functionally were. I'm good at it. He paused. And the students at this school need to know how to fight. If Voldemort comes back properly, when he comes back properly, he won't restrict himself to targeting me. Dumbledore looked at him for a long time. Then, what would you call it? Harry had thought about this. Dumbledore's army, he said. Because I'd like everyone who joins it to remember whose authority authorizes it, so that any ministry interference runs into your name before it runs into mine. Something like delight moved through Dumbledore's expression. Ah, he said. Strategic. I learned from someone, Harry said. He told Ron and Hermione at the end of August, back at Grimmauld Place, which had been thoroughly cleaned and de-horrored and was now a functional, warm house rather than a monument to ancestral darkness, Sirius having taken to the renovation with the energy of someone who had been in Azkaban for 12 years and was now in possession of a house he'd hated since childhood and could therefore redecorate with complete impunity. Ron's response to the Dumbledore's army proposal was immediate and enthusiastic. Hermione's was more layered. She wanted to know the curriculum, the recruitment process, the authorization documentation, and whether Harry had considered the liability implications if a student was injured during practical work. Harry answered all of it, and by the end of the conversation she'd added 7 items to his curriculum list and suggested 3 organizational improvements to the recruitment process that were genuinely better than what he'd planned. You want me to run the administrative side, she said, seeing his expression. You'd be very good at it, he said. I would, she agreed, without false modesty. Fine. But I want real input on the curriculum, not just logistics. Obviously, he said. Ron was already drawing up a list of names on a piece of parchment, writing with the energy of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of project. Neville, obviously. Luna Lovegood, don't make that face, Hermione, she's got the most unusual magical approach I've ever seen, she'd be brilliant at this. The twins. Ginny. Cho Chang, Cedric. Harry said. Ron looked up. He's not technically at Hogwarts. He's taking supplementary 7th-year courses, Harry said. I already asked him. He said yes. Right, Ron said. Obviously. He added the name. And Crumb. Harry considered this. He's in Bulgaria. But I've been corresponding with him. He looked at the list. He can't be at Hogwarts, but if we're building something that's supposed to outlast the immediate crisis, having someone in his position as a connected ally is worth more than his physical presence in a room. Ron wrote Crumb, International Liaison on the list and underlined it twice. Hermione looked at the parchment over his shoulder. Then she looked at Harry. "You've been thinking about this as something that goes beyond fifth year," she said. "I've been thinking about this," Harry said, "as something that goes beyond Voldemort. The DA as a concept, trained, capable witches and wizards who understand the framework and are committed to upholding it, that's not just a response to one Dark Lord. That's infrastructure." The sitting room was warm, a fire going even in August because Grimmauld Place had old heating habits that Sirius hadn't gotten around to fixing, and the light caught Hermione's face and Ron's face and the parchment between them, and Harry felt the thing in his chest with its familiar warmth and its steady pulse, and thought, this is exactly what it looks like. The work. The people. The thing that Merlin meant when he said power was the scaffold. This was what you built on it. From upstairs, Sirius's voice floated down, "Is someone going to eat this dinner or am I cooking for purely personal satisfaction?" "Coming." Ron shouted, already standing. Harry rolled up the parchment and pocketed it, and the awakening stone was warm beside it, and outside the window London was going golden with the last of August's light, and in 3 days he'd be back on the Hogwarts Express. He was looking forward to it. September the 1st. Platform 9 3/4 in its familiar organized chaos, families and trunks and owls and the Hogwarts Express building steam at the platform's edge. Harry moved through it with the ease of someone who had stopped finding crowds alarming because he'd spent a summer in Wisengamot sessions, and crowds with agendas were considerably more demanding than crowds in motion. He found his compartment. Hermione and Ron were already there, and Neville, and a girl with silver hair and enormous eyes and earrings made of butterbeer corks who looked at Harry when he came in with the serene interest of someone who found everything equally remarkable and therefore nothing threatening. "You're Harry Potter Ambrosius," she said. "Not odd. Just identifying." "Harry's fine," he said. "Luna Lovegood," she said. "Neville said you might want me in the army." "Yes," Harry said, sitting down. "Good," she said, returning to her upside-down copy of the Quibbler. "I've been preparing." Harry looked at Neville, who gave a small shrug that conveyed yes she means it, no I don't know exactly what that involves, yes I'm confident it's something. The train began to move. London fell away, and the countryside opened up, and Harry pressed 2 fingers briefly to his forehead, the habit that had replaced checking for the scar's warmth, which was gone, and thought about the year ahead. The DA. The remaining Horcruxes. The Wisengamot's reform schedule. Voldemort's silence, which was not absence but thought. The awakening stone in his pocket pulsed once, warm and certain, and he thought he felt in it, underneath the warmth, the 1,000-year-old patience of the man who'd left it for him, the approval of someone who had trusted the stone to find the right person, and had been right. He looked out the window at Britain unrolling past in green and gold. "Right," he said, to no one in particular, and to everyone. "Let's get to work." Chapter 6, The Last Heirs Answer the Message came in November, written in a hand Harry recognized from the graveyard. Not Wormtail's. Not any of Voldemort's known servants. The handwriting was precise and controlled and slightly archaic in its letter formation, the way people wrote when they'd learned their letters in a different century. It arrived not by owl but by something older, it appeared on the surface of the awakening stone itself, text rising through the rock like ink through water, gold on grey, visible only to Harry. The heir has been busy. So have I. There is a conversation we should finish. Come alone. The place where your line began. No signature. None needed. Harry sat with it for a long time in the room of requirement, which had become his primary working space through 5th year, large and warm, the Merlin vault's adjoining chamber replicated as closely as possible, bookshelves and a fire and the stone table from the original translated into something new. He held the awakening stone and read the message again and felt the thing in his chest doing something careful and attentive. The place where your line began. Godric's Hollow. He didn't tell Hermione first. He didn't tell Ron. He told Dumbledore, because the last 2 years had taught him that Dumbledore informed and Dumbledore as unknowing variable were two different strategic situations, and he'd learned to prefer the former. Dumbledore read the message. Harry held the stone out and let him see the text, and then looked at Harry with the expression that had replaced the earlier version, the one that had always been slightly managing. This one was simply present. "You intend to go," he said. "Yes. That part I'm less committed to," Harry said. "But the conversation needs to happen one-on-one. If I bring the DA and Voldemort reads it as an ambush, we lose whatever ground the graveyard built." He paused. "I'll need someone at the perimeter. Enough presence to respond if it goes wrong, far enough back not to be felt." "Severus," Dumbledore said. Harry had expected this. "And Sirius," he said. "Because I trust Sirius's judgment on when something has gone wrong more than I trust anyone's assessment except my own." A pause. "Sirius and Severus in close proximity, unsupervised, they're adults," Harry said. "Tell them both that if they hex each other before I get back I'll be extremely disappointed. That'll work on Sirius and might work on Snape." Dumbledore almost smiled. "When?" "3 days. I want to spend 2 of them in the vault and 1 doing whatever needs to be done here first." He thought about the DA, about the session scheduled for tomorrow, 30 members now, the best practical magic being done at Hogwarts in a generation, and Harry running it the way Merlin's journals described running a school of magic, from the front, by doing, not by explaining from a distance. "The Nagini situation needs resolution before I walk into that conversation. She's the last Horcrux. If I go to Godric's Hollow and Voldemort is still anchored to mortality through the snake, the meeting's dynamic is completely different than if he isn't." "You have a plan for Nagini." "I have a plan for Nagini," Harry confirmed. The plan for Nagini was Neville. Not because Harry needed to delegate the danger, he would have handled it himself without hesitation, but because the plan itself required Neville specifically, and because this was one of the things Harry had been building toward since 3rd year without naming it until now. Neville's magic had been developing through the DA's sessions with the particular quality of growth that happens when something has been artificially suppressed and then released, fast, deep, occasionally startling in its strength. He could produce a fully corporeal Patronus now. He'd mastered nonverbal casting 2 months before OWL. Year required it. And his specific gift, the intuitive connection to living things, the herbological magic that was the modern remnant of something older, was exactly what you needed for a target like Nagini. Harry explained it in the room of requirement, late on a Tuesday, just the 2 of them. "Voldemort's in Godric's Hollow," he said. "Or near it. With the snake. I can feel the Horcrux signature from here, it's gotten stronger over the last month, which means he's been working on reconstituting his connection to her as his anchor point." He looked at Neville. "I need to meet with him. Before I do, I need the snake gone. Not killed immediately, because killing her while she's his anchor creates a magical backlash that could hurt anyone nearby. I need her separated from him first." Neville looked at the map Harry had laid on the table between them, Godric's Hollow, the surrounding area, the approximate position of Voldemort's presence as the old magic read it. "How do I separate a giant magical snake from the most dangerous dark wizard alive?" he asked, with the specific tone he developed in DA sessions where someone had asked him something complicated and he was already running the approach in his head. "The same way you'd separate any living thing from something it's been bound to against its nature," Harry said. "Nagini was human once. Voldemort's magic transformed her, bound her, turned her into a Horcrux against whatever her original self was. She's not evil, she's trapped. The herbological magic you use to restore damaged plants to their natural state, regenerative essence," Neville said slowly. "Applied to a person rather than a plant," Harry said. "Or something that was a person. It won't restore her to human form, that damage is too old and too deep. But it'll dissolve the Horcrux binding. Detach the soul fragment. Make her a snake again instead of an anchor." He looked at Neville. "Can you do that?" Neville was quiet for a moment. I've never applied it to something alive, he said. It's designed for things that have been magically damaged, plants, mostly, but the principle, he stopped. Thought. Yes, he said. I can do it. I'll need to be close enough to touch her. I know, Harry said. And she won't want to be touched. I know that too. He slid a vial across the table, one of the preparations he'd worked on from Merlin's journals, a calming compound that worked on serpentine magic specifically, developed by Merlin himself for working with the ancient snake familiars of the pre-wand era. That goes into the air around her. I'll tell her what's happening. She'll understand me. Neville looked at the vial. Then at Harry. You've been planning this for a long time. Since the vault, Harry said. Since I understood what all the pieces were. He met Neville's eyes. You don't have to do this. I can find another approach. Don't be ridiculous, Neville said, with a firmness that left no room for argument. He picked up the vial. When? Tomorrow night, Harry said. Before I go to Godric's Hollow on Thursday. Neville nodded, pocketed the vial, and stood up. He was taller than he'd been in first year, they both were, obviously, 5 years was 5 years, but the height felt different on Neville than it did on most people. Like he'd grown into something rather than just upward. Harry, he said, at the door. Yeah. Be careful. Not because you can't handle it. Because I'd like you to still be here in January. Harry smiled. Same, he said. Neville left the school at 11 the following night, under the cloak with Harry as far as the gates, and then alone through the village in the direction of the Horcrux signal that Harry had mapped precisely enough to direct him to within 20 feet. Harry stood at the gate and felt the signal, Nagini's location, the Horcrux fragment's dark pulse, and monitored it while Neville moved. An hour of waiting. The kind of waiting where every minute had weight. Then the dark pulse shifted. Flickered. And changed quality completely, not gone, not destroyed, but detached, floating free of the snake's life force, loose in the air rather than anchored in flesh. Harry felt it dissipate the way a smoke signal dissipates in wind, the soul fragment releasing upward and outward and becoming simply part of the ambient background of dark magic that saturated the area, diffuse and harmless. The snake's signature below it was clean. Just a snake. Old and large and magically potent in the way of all creatures that had been touched by extraordinary power for decades, but free of the corruption that had been layered over it. Neville appeared back at the gate 20 minutes later. He handed Harry the vial, empty. His hands were completely steady. She let me, he said. Once I spoke in Parseltongue, you spoke Parseltongue. Harry said. You told me to tell her what was happening. You didn't say how. Neville had the expression of someone who had discovered something about themselves under pressure and was still processing it. The calming compound helped. And then I talked to her. Whatever I said, she understood. She stopped moving. She let me put my hands on her. Harry looked at him for a long moment. The regenerative magic, Neville said, it was like pulling a thorn out of something that had been built around the thorn for so long it had forgotten what it was like without it. She made a sound when the fragment released. He paused. I think it was relief. Harry pressed a hand briefly to Neville's shoulder. Nothing elaborate. Just acknowledgement, real and direct. Thank you, he said. Neville nodded once. Go finish it, he said. Godric's Hollow on a Thursday night in November was cold and clear, the village quiet, frost on the church gate and on the lane that led to the Potter Cottage ruins. Harry walked the lane alone, no cloak, no concealment of any kind, the old magic running through him in its integrated way, not switched on, not deployed, just present, the way breathing was present. He'd left Sirius and Snape at the village perimeter, close enough that a signal would reach them in under a minute, far enough that the conversation could be what it needed to be. The ruins were just ruins. He'd been here before, in 4th year, briefly, to understand the geography of the night his parents died. He'd stood where the cottage had stood and felt the weight of it, not grief exactly, not anymore. Something more like gravity. The pull of a place where enormous things had happened. Tonight the ruins were not empty. He was there already, the small robed figure from the graveyard, but different now. More present. More complete. Over the last year and a half Harry had felt the Voldemort signature on the edges of his awareness, always distant, always working, always in the process of attempting something, but tonight it was close and still, and the quality of it was different in a way that the old magic read clearly. He'd been here for a while. Not waiting, exactly. Sitting with something. Harry stopped at the edge of what had been the garden. The frost-killed grass between them. The stone wall that the cottage had once connected to, still standing, the rest gone. A sky full of stars. You destroyed the snake's Horcrux, Voldemort said. Last night, Harry confirmed. I felt it. A pause. You expected me to respond with violence. I expected you to consider it, Harry said. I thought you'd decide against it. The small figure turned. He was still not fully reconstituted, the body was better than the graveyard, more stable, but still had the quality of something that hadn't finished arriving. The face was between faces, between Tom Riddle and Voldemort, the flat, pale severity of one and the sharp, dark-eyed hunger of the other not yet fully resolved into either. Why, Voldemort said. The same word as the graveyard. Same register. Because you've been thinking, Harry said. For 18 months. That's a long time for someone who spent 40 years not thinking about anything but survival and power. He walked to the stone wall and sat on it, which brought him to approximately Voldemort's eye level. You read the documentation. About the framework. About what I'm building. Ragnarok told me there was an inquiry from a solicitor acting on behalf of an unnamed client about the specific legal language of the Creature Rights Restoration Clause. A long silence. You were the unnamed client, Harry said. The Goblin Rights Clause, Voldemort said, with a precision that was entirely Tom Riddle, if implemented as written, would restructure the Gringotts Compact with the Ministry in a way that effectively removes the Ministry's oversight authority over Gringotts entirely. Yes, Harry said. That's the point. The Ministry would resist it. They're already resisting it. They'll resist it for a decade and then it'll be established law and they'll have resisted it for a decade for nothing. Harry looked at the ruins of the cottage. You're a lawyer's son. Well. Your father was. Tom Riddle Sr. had no magic and no interest in the wizarding world, but his family had been in law for 3 generations. He paused. That's in Merlin's journals, actually. The bloodline tracking. Riddle family, minor legal practitioners, Gaunt family, descended from Slytherin, no documented magical practice after the 17th century because the Gaunt line had too much inbreeding and not enough. I know my family history, Voldemort said. I know you do, Harry said. I'm saying that the thing you are underneath everything you've built, the legal mind, the precise thinking, the specific gift for structure, that's in your history. That's not Voldemort. That's Tom Riddle. The night settled around them. Frost on the grass. Starlight. The ruins of a house where a war had been redirected 15 years ago. You want to offer me something, Voldemort said. I want to ask you something, Harry corrected. The offer's already been on the table since June 1995. It doesn't change. Ask. Do you want to be part of this, Harry said simply. Not Voldemort. Tom Riddle. The framework restoration, the legal reforms, the reconstruction of what was supposed to be there before the old families took it. You understand it better than most people I've talked to. You understood the Creature Rights Clause well enough to hire a solicitor to query it. He looked at Voldemort steadily. You have a legal mind and 2,000 years of magical history in your blood. Those are useful things. You're asking a Dark Lord, Voldemort said slowly, to become a legal consultant. I'm asking Tom Riddle, Harry said, what he actually wants, now that the plan he built as Voldemort has hit a wall. A very long silence. I have done things, Voldemort said, in the register that wasn't either voice, that was underneath both of them, that cannot be undone, Harry said. I know. The framework isn't forgiveness. I told you in the graveyard, the consequences will be paid. There's an accounting to be done that I won't be the one to manage, because I'm not a judge and the deaths of the people you killed are not mine to adjudicate. But there's a difference between accountability and annihilation. He turned the awakening stone over in his hand, warm in the cold night. What do you want, Tom? Not what Voldemort spent 40 years wanting. What do you want? The figure across the frost-killed grass was still for a very long time. When he spoke, it was quiet, and the voice was almost unfamiliar, neither the high theatrical register nor the cold precision. Something underneath both. I want, Tom Riddle said, to not be afraid. Harry looked at him. The old magic pulsed, steady and warm. That's the most honest thing you've said to anyone in 40 years, Harry said. Yes. The fear doesn't stop because you have enough power, Harry said. You know that. You proved it. You had more magical power than almost anyone alive and you were still afraid, all the time, because the thing you were afraid of wasn't a thing power could fix. He put the awakening stone away. The framework. What I'm building. The world where Tom Riddle's origins are not a sentence. Where orphans don't grow up in Muggle homes being told they're worthless and then discover they're magical and walk into a world that sorts them immediately into worth and worthless again with different vocabulary. He met those eyes, dark, Tom Riddle's eyes, not the red of Voldemort, the dark brown that photographs in the old Hogwarts records showed, the eyes that had looked at Diagon Alley for the first time and thought I matter here before learning the conditions under which that was true. That world doesn't make you afraid, because in that world you always mattered. Not because of the Slytherin blood. Just because you were there. Tom Riddle looked at him. You can't have that world back, Harry said. The past version of you who could have lived in it is gone. But you can help build it. You can make sure nobody else follows the path you followed, because you know every step of it better than anyone alive. He paused. If that's what you want. The ruins of the Potter cottage stood silent between them, 15 years of history in every cracked stone and frost-dusted timber. Harry sat on the garden wall and waited. The accounting, Tom Riddle said finally. You said consequences. Yes, Harry said. Real ones. Not Azkaban. Azkaban is a tool of the old system and I'm taking it apart. But real accountability. Something that requires you to face what was done and participate in repairing it, to the extent that repair is possible. He held Tom Riddle's gaze. Hard. Longer than anything else. Not comfortable. And on the other side of it. On the other side of it, Harry said, there's a world that looks different from this one. And you helped build it. And that's in the record, alongside everything else. The stars moved slowly overhead. The frost deepened. Harry waited without impatience, because patience was something the awakening stone had given him alongside everything else, the 1,000-year patience of something that had been waiting the right amount of time and knew the right moment when it arrived. Tom Riddle said, "What do you need me to do first?" He didn't tell everyone immediately. He told Dumbledore in the morning, who received the information with the sustained, profound silence of someone processing a thing so far outside their models of what was possible that the models themselves needed restructuring first. He gave me the remaining Death Eater locations, Harry said. The ones the Ministry investigation hasn't reached. He gave me the specific Horcrux destruction methodology he'd used, so I can verify the remaining fragments are cleared. And he agreed to formal custody at Gringotts, not the Ministry, pending the accountability structure. He paused. Ragnarok setting up the containment today. Tom's already there. Dumbledore looked at his hands. He looked at his desk. He looked at the spinning instruments. Then he looked at Harry. How, he said. Not disbelief. Something larger than disbelief, something that had moved past disbelief into a kind of wondering. Merlin's framework isn't selective, Harry said. It doesn't get to be. The moment you start deciding who it applies to, it stops being a framework and becomes a preference. He picked up one of the small silver instruments from Dumbledore's desk, the one that had always spun faster when he touched it, the one he'd noticed in third year. You've been fighting Voldemort for 30 years. You built your whole strategy around a final conflict. A death. One of them has to kill the other. He set the instrument down. I found a different answer. Dumbledore looked at the instrument. The prophecy, he said quietly. Neither can live while the other survives, Harry said. Voldemort survives in Tom Riddle. Tom Riddle isn't Voldemort anymore. The soul was fractured into pieces that have now been removed or destroyed, except the contracted core, which has been retreating from Voldemort's choices for 18 months. He looked at Dumbledore. Tom Riddle can survive. Voldemort cannot. The prophecy resolves. He paused. Also, I've always thought the prophecy was a description of a possible future, not a fixed one. Trelawney made it in a pub. I've been taking it with appropriate salt. Dumbledore made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob and was somewhere in the vicinity of relief so large it didn't have a clean emotional category. He pressed his hand over his eyes for a moment. His other hand, Harry noticed, was undamaged, no blackened, dead fingers. The ring curse had never touched him, because Harry's caution note had been very clear and Dumbledore had, for once, followed it exactly. Harry was glad about that. He let himself be glad. What do you need from me? Dumbledore asked. Your public statement, Harry said. Explaining what happened. You carry more credibility with the wizarding world than I do on this, not because my standing is insufficient but because people will understand Dumbledore saying Voldemort is gone better than they'll understand the specifics of why he's gone. He met the old man's eyes. And then I need you to stop carrying the war alone. You've been doing that for 30 years. That's done. Dumbledore looked at him for a long time. You know, he said, very quietly, I have spent this entire time believing that I was the only one who understood what was at stake. I know, Harry said. That's what made you extraordinary and occasionally catastrophic simultaneously. He stood up. I don't say that as criticism. No, Dumbledore said. I know you don't. He straightened. The blue eyes were clearer than Harry had ever seen them. All right, Harry. Tell me what the statement should say. The Wizengamot was in emergency session within 24 hours. Not Harry's doing, Fudge had called it when Dumbledore's statement reached him, because Fudge's primary response to anything large was to call a meeting so he could be seen responding before the response itself had been decided. Harry arrived in the Ambrosius seat to a chamber that was already vibrating with the specific energy of people who had been told something impossible and were variously deciding whether to believe it, what it meant for their position, or how to use it. He let Dumbledore speak first. The old man stood before the Wizengamot with 70 years of authority and chose to use it in the specific way he used things when he decided to be simple, directly, without rhetoric, without the usual musical cadence that made his words feel inevitable. He told them what had happened. Tom Riddle's surrender. The Horcrux situation. The accountability framework. Voldemort, as a force and a figure, conclusively and verifiably gone. The chamber reacted. Then Harry stood up. The war is over, he said. Which means the emergency conditions that have been used to justify a number of decisions in this chamber are also over. I want to talk about what comes next. He looked around the room, at Madame Longbottom, who was watching him with the still attention of someone who had been waiting for this moment, at Malfoy, whose expression was more complex than it had ever been, some calculation happening at a level below his usual surface precision, at the member whose name had been on the list and who was now looking at Harry with the specific anxiety of someone who had avoided consequences for a long time and felt their luck changing. The reforms we've passed are a start. The creature seats, the oversight panel, the conflict of interest declarations. Those are foundations. I want to talk about the structure that goes on top of them. He spoke for 40 minutes. Not from notes, he had the framework in his blood now, the original and the reformed version and the distance between them, every point of divergence and every possible point of return. He talked about the Wiesengemat's purpose as designed, the legal standing of all magical beings, the integration of creature magic into the formal magical framework rather than the parallel tolerated illegibility it currently occupied. He talked about Azkaban, the Dementors, the specific horror of a prison designed to destroy the humanity of the imprisoned, its function in the old power structure and its fundamental incompatibility with the framework he was restoring. The Dementors need to go, he said. Not managed differently. Gone. The creatures themselves are miserable and their presence in the world is a misery generator. Every year they exist they make more people afraid, and more fear is the thing we are specifically trying not to build more of. He looked at the chamber. The ministry will need to develop actual detention practices. Real ones, that don't rely on torturing inmates into incapacitation. That's harder than it sounds and it should be. He paused. Hard things that are right are still the things we have to do. Malfoy raised a hand. Harry nodded at him. The Dementor situation, Malfoy said. He was choosing his words with unusual care. As a logistical matter. The Dementors have been under ministry contract since 1718, Harry said. I know the history. He looked at Malfoy steadily. Make a proposal. An actual one, logistics, alternatives, timeline. You have legal and financial resources this chamber has been using badly. Use them usefully. He let that sit. I'm not interested in enemies, Mr. Malfoy. I've spent 2 years being told you were one. I think you're a man who made a very large mistake in a very specific political climate and has been managing the consequences of it inside a system that rewarded the mistake rather than challenging it. He paused. The system is changing. That gives you a chance to change with it. The choice is yours. A silence. Lucius Malfoy said, with a precision that stripped the sentence of everything except its meaning, I'll have a proposal on the Dementor situation to the chamber by the end of the month. Thank you, Harry said. The DA met that evening in the room of requirement, which had configured itself for the occasion as something between a classroom and a hall, large, warm, the stone walls alive with the same faint gold that they'd shown Harry the first time he'd found the room, the light more present than usual as if the room itself understood that tonight was different. 31 people. Not just students now, Cedric had come up from his 6th-year supplementary program, arriving with Cho and a quiet confidence that had been building since the tournament. Sirius, who had been attending sessions informally for the last month with the enthusiasm of someone who had been denied group activity for 12 years. Even Snape had stood in the doorway once, watched for 20 minutes, and left without comment, which Harry was counting as a form of approval. Harry stood in front of them and felt the room's warmth and thought about what to say, and then decided to say the thing that was true rather than the thing that was shaped. It's over, he said. The war. The immediate crisis. Tom Riddle is in Gringotts custody and will be there for as long as the accountability process takes. The Horcruxes are gone. The Death Eater network is being systematically addressed. Azkaban is going to start changing within the year. He looked at all of them. This room started as a crisis response. You learned to fight because there was a thing that was going to try to kill us and we needed to be able to respond to it. That's done. A beat of quiet. Then Neville, from the second row, and... Harry smiled. And what comes next is harder than fighting, which is building. The Wiesengemat reforms. The creature rights restoration. The educational framework, because Hogwarts teaches people to perform magic but not to understand it, and understanding it is what makes you safe and effective and not accidentally repeating history. He looked around the room. I want to keep this going. Not as a defensive organization. As something else. A parliament of people who understand what the framework is supposed to be and are willing to work within it and push it and make it better. He paused. Anyone who wants to stay should stay. Anyone for whom this was always just the war effort, no judgment. The war's over. Nobody left. Ron, from his spot in the third row, said, "Obviously nobody's leaving, Harry." "I know," Harry said. "I just wanted to give the option." "That's very thoughtful," Luna said, from somewhere near the back. "And structurally unnecessary." Laughter. Real laughter, the kind that comes when pressure releases, filling the warm room. Harry let himself laugh too. He stood in the room of requirement with 31 people who had chosen this, who kept choosing it, and he thought about Merlin's vault and the awakening stone and the patient thousand-year trust that had delivered him here, and he felt the thing in his chest, fully open, fully awake, fully his, and thought, good. He went to the vault alone on a Saturday in December, taking the long way through Gringotts, past the rune corridor where the lights had first activated under his touch, down to the familiar amber warmth of the chamber and the shelves and the stone table. He sat at the table and took out the awakening stone, which he still carried, which he suspected he would always carry. The stone was warm in the usual way. But today it was also something else, something he hadn't felt from it before. A quality of completion. Of a task whose parameters had been fully met. He looked at the 37 journals on the shelf. He looked at the staff he still hadn't touched, which was waiting with the particular patience of something that understood sequencing. He looked at the wrapped cloth that had contained the awakening stone, still on the table where it had been the first day, meaningless now but kept. He picked up the first journal. Opened it to the first page. The handwriting, which he could read as easily as English now, which he thought he would always be able to read, looked back at him. "I am writing this because I will not always be here," the first entry said. "And because the work I've done will need to be understood by whoever comes after me, and I have found that understanding is easier when the person who did the work explains it themselves rather than leaving it to be interpreted. The framework is not finished. I want to be clear about that. I have done the foundational work, set the original terms, established the compacts and the rights and the legal structure that underlies everything built on top of it. But a foundation is not a building. The building is the work of whoever occupies the foundation, generation after generation, and no one person gets to do it all. I have thought often about the person who will sit where I sat, who will open this journal, who will have survived the thing that activates the seal. I have hoped they are someone who understands that power is a material, not a destination. I have hoped they are someone who finds the people around them as interesting as the magic. I have hoped they are kind. Not soft, the world requires people who are not soft. But kind. There is a difference. If you are reading this, you survived death and opened the vault and touched the stone and learned what it has to teach. You have done things I couldn't predict and built things I didn't plan, and that is exactly as it should be. The framework is yours now. Don't be careful with it. Be brilliant. Harry sat with the journal for a long time in the amber light of the vault. Outside the chamber, outside Gringotts, outside the walls of the alley and the city, the world was doing what worlds do after large things resolve, not returning to what it was, because it never returned to what it was, but finding its new shape, the one that acknowledged what had happened and built forward from it. He thought about his parents, who had died so the seal could crack. He thought about Godric's hollow and the frost on the garden wall and Tom Riddle's voice saying "I want to not be afraid." He thought about Ron in the common room with his sandwiches and Hermione with her books and Neville in the dark outside the village, hands steady. He thought about being 15 years old and the most powerful magical practitioner in Britain and how those two facts coexisted without contradiction, how they'd always coexisted without contradiction, how the world had kept telling him one cancelled out the other and how the world had been wrong. He closed the journal. He stood, and picked up the staff from the table. He'd been putting this off for 2 years, not from fear. He'd stopped being afraid of things inside his inheritance almost immediately after the awakening, because the inheritance was him and you couldn't be afraid of yourself without a fight, but from the understanding that some things needed to be earned through sequence. The vault first. The stone first. The compacts, the Wisengamot, the graveyard, the parliament. The staff was the last piece. The full articulation of the bloodline in a physical form, Merlin's primary instrument, the tool built by the greatest sorcerer in recorded history for the work that no single generation had ever been sufficient to complete. It was lighter than he expected. It always was, with the things that were meant for you. The room changed when he held it. Not dramatically, not fire and noise and spectacle. Just a settling, the way a musical note settles when the right instrument plays it. The amber light of the vault deepened slightly and the gold under his skin became visible even here, in the warmth, and the thing in his chest expanded to meet the staff the way two rivers meet, not violently, not even with much fanfare, just the inevitable logic of water finding its level. He held it for a moment. Then he set it back down, gently, because he wasn't ready to carry it in public yet and he knew it, and some pieces of knowing yourself were about timing. He picked up the awakening stone, put it in his pocket, and walked out of the vault, up through the rune corridor, out through the main hall of Gringotts, and into Diagon Alley. It was a December afternoon, cold and bright, the alley lit for the season, warmth spilling from the shops. People moved around him, the ordinary daily motion of the wizarding world, and none of them knew what had just happened, and none of them needed to know yet. They would, eventually, know all of it, the compacts and the framework and what had changed and why, because transparency was part of the framework too, the part that the old families had always found least convenient. They would know, and they would have opinions, and some of those opinions would be wrong and some right and the work of sorting them out would take longer than Harry's lifetime. He was fine with that. Hermione was waiting outside the Gringotts steps, because of course she was, her breath misting in the cold, a scarf the color of autumn leaves around her neck and her face wearing the specific expression of someone who has been waiting for approximately as long as she was willing to wait and is now very close to the limit. "How long?" she said. 2 hours, he said. "I thought you said 1. I read the first journal entry again." She looked at him. Her expression softened by a fraction, the impatience giving way to something warmer. "How was it?" "Good," he said. He pulled the awakening stone from his pocket, turned it once in the winter light, warm and plain and impossible, grey stone with 1,000 years of patience in it, and put it back. He said to be brilliant. "Reasonable expectation," she said. "I thought so." He looked up the alley, at the crowd and the lights and the warm ordinary life of the wizarding world doing what it did. "Where's Ron?" "Weasley's wizard wheezes. Fred and George are testing something and he said he'd only be a minute, which means he's been in there for 40 and something has probably caught fire." Harry laughed. "Let's go get him." They went. The alley was bright and the cold was clean and somewhere ahead of them Ron was probably on fire in a purely figurative sense, and the awakening stone was warm in Harry's pocket, and the framework was in his blood, and the staff was in the vault waiting for when he was ready, and the world was in the long early morning of a thing that had just changed. He walked into it without hesitation, without looking back, the last heir's answer written in every step he took, on ground that had always been, in every way that mattered, entirely his.